your experience begin right now. From high atop the mountains of British Columbia to you listening around the world, this is Spaced Out Radio. You can follow us on our website, spacedoutradio.com, on Twitter, @SpacedOutRadio. Give our Facebook page a like, Spaced Out Radio Show. You can follow us on Instagram, Dave Scott, SOR, or on our YouTube channel, Spaced Out Radio Show.
Let us play with all our toys, they let us think that we're big boys, they let us make the louder noise, but women rule the world. They let us think we're Superman, that we're the only ones who can be strong, but we break on command, cause women rule the world.
Buckle up, space travelers. It's time to go for a ride as we are live on Spaced Out Radio.
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Said the deeper I go, the deeper I fall.
Good evening and welcome to Spaced Out Radio tonight. I am your host, Dave Scott. Good to have you with us on this Monday night, early Tuesday morning. If you are listening on spacedoutradio.com, on Spreaker, as well as on Revolution Radio. We come to you from tonight's show, broadcasting out of Uncle Jimbo's cabin in the Great White North, live on this Monday night, early Tuesday morning if you're on the East Coast. Here at Spaced Out Radio, we do this thing 3 hours a night, 7 days a week. That's because we want to be your official one-stop shop when it comes to the supernatural, paranormal, conspiratorial, spiritual, and so much more. If you like our music, you can head to Spaced Out Radio's website, where you can hear the guitar god himself, Ron Bumblefoot THAL, formerly of Guns N' Roses. Check out a couple of his music videos by clicking on the Bumblefoot banner. You can also follow us on Twitter, @SpacedOutRadio. Give our Facebook page a like, Spaced Out Radio Show. On Instagram, I can be followed at Dave Scott, SOR. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, Spaced Out Radio Show, and our website is spacedoutradio.com. At this time, we say, hi, how are you? What's going on to everyone in the Revolution Radio chat room on the High Plains Talk Radio Network, in the Spaced Out Radio chat room on Spreaker, along with our fans at Euphoria Chronicles, Chronicles of the Unknown, Forest Moon Paranormal, and our flagship chat room, the SOR Space Travelers. If you haven't signed up for the SOR Space Travelers Club yet, well, it's time. It's only $5 a month, and with that, your name gets entered into monthly prize draws. You get access to a private group interviews, access to a special section on our website, and so much more. Hey, we're going to give you a hell of a lot more than just access to our archives. While at spacedoutradio.com, you can read our latest blogs, and you can check out Eric Markham's SOR Spacewire for your latest and weird news. Tonight's show is brought to you by Rivulet Reiki and Readings, providing healings in person or to distance. PurplePlates.com, helping heal your body, mind, and soul. The New Agora newspaper is the official paper of this show. The iTunes app, Spirit Storybox. It's the official ghost hunting app of SOR. And remember, if you are a listener on Revolution Radio, it is the largest non-profit online radio station online. Do us a favor. Take the time to visit freedomslips.com and donate today. We do have some exciting news for all of our listeners. If you own a product of Apple, you can now, as of tonight, find Spaced Out Radio on iTunes. You can download your favorite podcast, the ones you want to listen to, and you can play them back again and again and again. So we welcome iTunes into the Spaced Out Radio family. It's good to be with them, and we will be doing a lot more on iTunes as time moves forward. Legend and folklore has always hid a revealing secret to the origins of the story. Looking back at how long the legend of Bigfoot has been around, for instance, all the First Nations clans know about it. To the extreme on this end, it's literally been centuries. In recent years, like a few decades, there's been Mothman, Slenderman, and other strange creatures that have haunted people. Are these true stories? Are they just old wives' tales to get children into bed on time? What's the deal with them? But on a serious note, what if some of them are true? What if conjuring up the dark spirits while playing with a Ouija board actually happened? What kind of trouble could playing with the darker side of the spiritual world really get us into? Well, this is where the folklore of the Bye-Bye Man comes into play. Frankly, up until researching this topic, I'd never even heard of this nightmarish tale. But there are plenty of stories like this that may not have the gusto that, say, demons or poltergeists do. This is why we bring in author Robert Schneck. He has written about the Bye-Bye Man. It's actually turning into a movie. Robert, welcome to Spaced Out Radio. How are you?
Good, Dave. Thank you for having me on.
It's a pleasure to have you on this show as well, and I apologize for going late with you. Normally we try and get started at the top of the hour right off the bat, but unfortunately we were having just a few technical difficulties with the computer here and the system. For some reason, my headphone jack was not working, and it was directing all my sound through my microphone jack, which was really weird, and I think we've solved it for tonight, but I'm excited to do this topic with you. I really am.
Oh, well, I'm looking forward to it.
Me too. I'm going to get you to speak up just a little bit more, if you don't mind.
All right. 1 second. How's that?
Much better. Thank you so much.
Okay. And I wasn't close enough to the microphone.
It does get that way. It definitely gets that way for sure.
But I think I've got my jacks in order, so I'm ready.
Excellent. And I appreciate that. So, Robert, getting to your story, because everyone has a story that leads them into these types of categories. Did you ever have anything weird or strange happen to you that kind of led you down this path, or was it just a mild curiosity to write about?
No, neither one really. It seems to be something in my temperament. I've always been that way. I've always been this way ever since I was a small child. I was always attracted to whatever was strange or anomalous. If there was a chance to watch any movie, I would watch the horror movie. If there was a chance to read a book, I would read the ghost stories. It just seemed to be something that I was born with. The way some people are born with 6 fingers, I was born with this predisposition to whatever is unusual. For me, it really became... I put a name to it when I was very young, and I found a copy of Stranger Than Science on my mother's night table. And I'm sure most of the people listening are familiar with the book by Frank Edwards. It was a collection of very short, strange but true tales that he collected on a wide variety of subjects, everything from hairy monsters to famous last words, that he put together into these little paperback books where he would boil the story down to, say, 2 pages with a catchy title. And he would tell the story briefly, and you could read through these books very quickly, and they were enormously popular. And once I read it, and I realized there were all these wonderful things in the world, monsters and ghosts and vampires and werewolves, that these things were not just something you came across in movies. Well, that did it for me. My life was more or less mapped out right there. And then I began going to the library. One of the first books on the subject I read was The Mothman Prophecies, which hadn't been out very long at the time. It was one of maybe 2 paranormal books that my library carried, and I read that many, many times. From there, I went on to writers like Ivan Sanderson and Bernard Heuvelman, and that more or less did it for me. I have been very involved in these sorts of things ever since, and to answer your question, no, I never had anything paranormal ever happened to me. I never saw a ghost when I was a child, never heard a voice calling me, none of those things. I never even had an imaginary friend. It was just, that was never really part of my makeup. Oh, I've had a few little things happen that might have been considered psychic. Oh, somebody would ask me if I could guess something, and it was usually something incredibly obscure, and I guessed it, but I'm not going to make very much out of that. So, again, I would call it more a natural inclination than a result of either experience or mild curiosity.
And it's interesting that you really haven't had an experience, but just this childhood fascination. How good is that for you as a career, Robert, to be able to write about this type of information and these stories? Because this is something that intrigued you right through your childhood. It intrigued you, obviously, into adulthood. Is it great to be able to take your own imagination and take these stories and meld something together?
Well, it's funny. It really doesn't involve a lot of imagination on my part. I think if I had to, I would compare it to something I did when I was little. My parents had a big set of encyclopedias that I was always leafing through because they were there. So I was always leafing through these encyclopedias. They were filled with pictures. And every time I found something that I thought was interesting, I would run to my mother or father and show it to them. And I think I've more or less continued doing that as an adult. When I'm reading or I'm listening to the news or listening to the radio or one of the many podcasts I listen to, and I hear something interesting, I want to tell other people about it. But as an adult, you can actually write it down and sell it, which is a pretty good deal because, again, this is what fascinates me. So I would be doing this anyway. I'm always reading about these things, as well as reading more mainstream history and sociology, things like that. But I will always go for whatever is on the border of anomalous or deviant or other things that other people tend to dismiss or simply overlook. That just is where my eye lands, so I then pursue it.
Is it living a childhood dream, though, being able to do this and write about these topics?
Well, yes, it actually is, because when I was little, all I wanted to do was meet Ivan Sanderson and meet John Keel and meet these people. Of course, a lot of them died before I had the chance to do that. But as an adult, I'm friends with people like Lauren Coleman and Joseph Citro, who's famous for his New England tales. These are my friends. I write to them. We correspond. We meet each other. It's amazing. It's a very small club, but we all know each other, and I think we all get along pretty well. And we're always doing things that interest each other. The really great thing about it, when we find something that we think the other person will be interested in, we send it to them. Because we all have our specialties. So it really is just such a great thing to be able to stand in front of a group of people who want to hear about some oddity that's... Well, I'll give you an example. In my last book, Mrs. Wakeman versus the Antichrist, I devoted a chapter to people that commit suicide by self-decapitation. Now, that is not a subject that I can go talk about at the Lions Club or the Ladies' Garden Club, but I can go to the Morbid Anatomy Library in Brooklyn and give a talk on it and attract a large crowd, and even put up gruesome pictures. So for me, it's just the best thing in the world.
Would you call yourself a thriller-type writer, or are you more into the horror genre?
Neither one. If you ask me what I write, I would say that I write history. Because everything that I'm involved in involves usually American history. That's what really interests me. And that is what I use to help reel in a little bit from, when you're willing to write about anything and everything, you can get a little scattered. So I concentrate on things that happen in the United States, although, to be honest, I have to tell you, my very first published article, my second published article was on something that happened in Canada. It was a little town. There was a town called Halifax, not the big city, a small town called Halifax, where the entire town was pretending it was haunted to drive this local judge crazy because he believed in spiritualism and no one else did. And they finally sent an investigator up from the American Society for Psychical Research to investigate the town, and he followed the judge around, and he realized that everyone in the town was doing things to make him think the town was haunted. It was a good story. It appeared in in a magazine called The Beaver, which was the magazine of the Canadian Historical Society. That's a long time ago now.
I just find it absolutely intriguing that you are able to develop and find these stories. You obviously research your information. Where are you finding these? How do they come across your desk?
Well, a couple of ways. In a few cases, a very few cases, it comes from people telling me about something that I never heard about. However, my most popular story, which we'll be talking about later, came that way. It was unusual. Most of the time, I will come across them in my reading, and I am also I go through old online newspaper articles constantly. I probably spend hours a week digging through these old newspaper archives because I am constantly finding things that are just fascinating. They might not have happened. Old newspapers were notorious for making things up or wildly exaggerating them, just the way modern newspapers do. But I have found things that way that really surprised me. I'll give you an example. In my next book, the next book is going to be collections of strange but true stories like the previous two. But this one, I think, is going to be a lot more emphasis on madness. There's going to be more stories of people that were insane and did things that were very unusual. So one of the stories, for example, is going to be on a minister in Michigan who murdered one of his parishioners and chopped up the body and stuffed it into a stove in the church. He did all this. He murdered him, chopped him up, and stuffed him in the stove inside the church, and then disappeared. This happened in the early 20th century. Now, when I found the story, I said, wow, I never heard of that. And I am a big true crime reader. I read true crime constantly. And so I did a little research, and I finally contacted the local historical society, and they were thrilled because they never heard of it. Even though it happened in a relatively small county, it had been completely forgotten in the 100 or so years since it had happened. So they were happy, and they did more research for me than I could have hoped for. And they sent it to me, so I've got a terrific story lined up for the next book, and a bunch of others. But again, as often happens, it does come from reading old newspaper stories. In some cases, again, another story from Mrs. Wakeman versus the Antichrist. It is something that had been bothering me for years. I don't know how many of your listeners are familiar with this, but at the moment, there is a clown panic going on in the United States.
Yes.
Right.
It scares the hell out of me, Robert. I'm not going to lie.
Oh, you're a cowrophobe.
Yeah,
That's what they call it. But the clown panic that is going on now is nothing new. A lot of people don't realize this, but there have been clown panics going on in the United States and other parts of the world since at least 1980, or early 1980, 81, I think. I haven't read that chapter in a while, but in my last book, I devoted a chapter to what I think is the origin of these clowns, where they came from, and what they originally represented before they jumped into mainstream popular urban folklore. And again, this was an example of one of the great things about knowing these people is that Loren Coleman is the man who discovered the first American clown panic, and he wrote about it in his book Mysterious America. for people that want to get a little background on clown panics, I suggest they take a look at Mysterious America or Mrs. Wakeman versus the Antichrist, because you'll see that this is nothing new. It's happened before. It was not reported online or on television at the time, but it certainly was reported in the newspaper. So there have been a series of these. Although in the original version, the clowns drove vans. I don't think they're driving vans in the current panic.
And somebody goes and puts a picture on the SOR Space Travelers. Bill Cardwell puts clown panic, and he puts a picture of a clown. I'm under your bed, waiting. Oh, it just scares the hell out of me. Absolutely scares the living daylights. And you know what? I don't know what it is, because when I was a child, I loved clowns. Everything to do with them. The magic, the balloon tricks, the bad form.
If you don't mind me asking, Dave, how old are you?
I'm 43. Okay,
so when you were growing up, you're a little young to have been there when John Wayne Gacy was was in all the headlines. And I don't. Are you? Did you watch the TV miniseries It when it came out?
No, I didn't. But I recall. I remember watching it at the full-on movie as a kid.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you remember Pennywise the Dancing Clown.
Yes.
Well, those things. People often blame Pennywise for starting these panics, but the fact is, Pennywise came years afterwards. I think the book came out in '86, I believe, and the first widespread clown panic occurred in the very early 1980s. Now, in my book, I have a theory that I obviously can't prove, because it's just something that I'd been thinking about for a couple of years. But I believe that the clown, the figure of the frightening clown, the phantom clown, the killer clown, because these early clowns in vans were carrying weapons, usually knives or even guns. And there was an odd sexual thing to it, where some of them weren't wearing pants, and of course they were approaching small children in their vans. So you've got the whole serial killer, child molester thing going on with clowns. And keep in mind that they also began to appear around the same times as the first satanic ritual abuse stories were coming out, and the panics that were occurring in daycare centers, where there was this sudden massive fear of pedophiles. So there was something going on in it. Again, I'm only talking about the United States here. I don't know what was going on in other, in Canada or Mexico, but I think that this had its origins in the United States, and I think specifically it had its origins in America's black culture, because you'll find that a lot of these stories begin in black neighborhoods, in cities that are predominantly black, and I think that the modern version of the Phantom Clown goes back to the Atlanta child killings, where, for those who remember, this was something that went on in the 1970s, where black children were being abducted and murdered in the city of Atlanta. And although some people put the number of children as high as 40, it was probably much fewer. That was a list the police put together, and it was always very controversial. But among the black and white citizens, I later found out, of Atlanta, there were a lot of rumors floating around before the killer was caught. There were rumors floating around about people being abducted in vans. Specifically in the black community, there were stories that black children were being abducted by the Center for Disease Control to create the cancer drug interferon. There was an idea that black children's blood was needed to create the drug interferon. And this, as surprising as it sounds, this was not something new in black folklore. This actually goes back to something earlier called the night doctors. And the night doctors was this belief that began in the 19th century, probably, and continued well into the 20th century, at least into the 1920s and 30s, because I have clippings coming up to that point, where it was believed that doctors and medical students would travel around at night and abduct black people and use them in experiments and dissect them and use their blood to make medication. In fact, there was a belief for years that castor oil was made from the blood or the fat of black victims who had been abducted by these night doctors. And the night doctors would do things like they would travel around in carts with muffled wheels, and their horses would have rubber-soled shoes on so that you couldn't hear them coming. They would wear disguises. They would throw hypodermic needles at people full of drugs that would paralyze them, and then they would be carried off. Now, again, you can say that sounds like a crazy kind of folklore. However, it is also true that throughout the 19th century, and again well into the 20th century, black people that died in the South had a very good chance of their bodies being stolen and sold to medical schools for dissection specimens. So yes, there was an actual, there were bodies being stolen. I mean, if the numbers are staggering, I mean, it's the sort of thing where you have to look into the real history of it. It's shocking. So, but again, the night doctors didn't come out of nowhere. There was also the very real Ku Klux Klan, and there was, when you look at the early night doctor folklore, there was a lot of overlapping. They would call them Ku Klux doctors. So there was an overlapping between the Ku Klux Klan and these night doctors. And think about the Ku Klux Klan for a minute. They were white-faced men carrying weapons, wearing bizarre clothing, and doing terrible things to black people, which is not a bad description of what these clowns are. They were bizarre, grotesque, white-faced people who would abduct, again, in the original version, they were grabbing black children and taking them off to something horrible. I actually think that there is a connection between black folklore about the clowns, about the Klan, rather, and modern folklore about the clowns. And even that similarity in names, Klan and clown, might sound like a tenuous connection, but in folklore that's not unusual. For example, take Kool cigarettes, Kool cigarettes. At one point, there was an attempt to market Kool cigarettes to black consumers. However, the K in the Kool was interpreted by many black consumers as a symbol of the Klan, and that this was a Klan plot to kill black people by giving them cancer through cigarettes. So the Kool cigarette brand never took off among the target audience. So again, what sounds odd actually does have an effect. Now, the Ku Klux Klan, however, of course, again, didn't come out of nowhere. I think that the original, well, I won't say the original, but one of the earliest forms of where the clowns might have come from were people who used to patrol the communities to make sure slaves didn't come out at night. They were called patter-rollers, which is just a sort of slang term for patroller, patter-roller. And they would sometimes dress up in grotesque costumes and to try to keep people inside at night because they didn't want black slaves roaming, specifically because they were afraid that they would steal things and sell them to other plantations, or that they might be fomenting a revolution, which was that was one of the great terrors of the South during slavery. And if you want to go back one step further to possibly the very beginning, you've got white-faced people taking black slaves on in Africa and carrying them away in a bizarre vehicle that many had never seen before, off to a horrific fate. Most people don't realize this, but one of the great terrors of being taken by slavers among Africans at the time was the belief that white people were not enslaving black slaves, but eating them. And that is why they took them in such enormous numbers, why they just kept taking them and taking them and taking them, because they were actually eating them. So, take this basic idea of these white-faced cannibal monsters, and it's not too great a stretch to see the shadow of that in these modern clowns that seem to be concentrating on abducting children. Boy, I talked about that for longer than I was expecting.
That's all right. I was wondering if you actually were breathing through that whole through there. It's difficult for me being way up here in the west coast of Canada and you being in New Jersey for me to get you a defibrillator that quickly. You know what I'm saying?
I find the subject interesting, and once I get started, it's hard to stop. But
I really don't mind. It makes my job easier, Rob.
Oh, all right. Well, the idea of this also, the only reason I take some satisfaction in having put this idea together is that some other people that have looked into the phantom clowns and the clown panics think there might be something. They think there might be something to it. Specifically, writers like Theo Pymans and Joe Derwin. And I would recommend to listeners to read Joe Derwin's essay on frightening clowns and where the idea of the frightening clown might have come from. In fact, he's also got a Facebook page on it called Dark Clowns that they might want to look into. It's very interesting.
Do you think Hollywood now, the way that clowns have kind of been ostracized in such a fashion, that Hollywood and video games really has a huge part to play in the demonizing of what was supposed to be a happy children's character? Because, I mean, you look at Bozo the Clown now, I mean, he's bearing some mean fangs.
Well, I think that might be a chicken and egg question. I do know of some early scary clowns. Some people, for example, say the Joker was an early scary clown. I'll be honest, I never thought of him as a clown. I don't know why. That just never occurred to me. But they point to the Joker and they point to a few other things. But the fact of the matter is that though most of what they're talking about appeared after the first big clown panic of the early 1980s. Pennywise, the dancing clown, appeared after that. It is true that John Wayne Gacy was earlier than that. And I think John Wayne Gacy played a part in crystallizing the idea of the modern scary clown because, and again, I sometimes forget that I'm a little older than some people. So for those who aren't familiar with him, John Wayne Gacy was a serial killer right outside of Chicago in the mid-'70s. He was caught, and he abducted, murdered, and tortured young men. In fact, his crawl space beneath his house was full of bodies, so many that when people came into his house, they could smell the decay. But John Wayne Gacy was not one of those loners who, the neighbors said he never spoke, but he always seemed nice enough. He was actually a very busy man who was involved in the JCs, and he was involved in all sorts of community activities. And one of these community activities was he would take part in parades where he would dress up as a clown. So here was a genuine serial killer whose hobby was dressing up as a clown called Pogo. And I think that there was another clown called Patches that had yet another costume for. But the image of Pogo, a photograph specifically that was taken of John Wayne Gacy standing on the porch of his house, a house that we now know had 30 bodies in the basement and a couple more buried on the property. The idea of seeing him standing there in full clown makeup, waving to the camera, I think that made a very memorable impression on the public. Here was a serial killer clown. It was real, and it was a frightening thing that I don't think was ever able to roll back. I think it kind of pointed out to people that, look, clowns are grotesque. Clowns are suspicious. What are they hiding behind that makeup? Why is this grown adult acting so strangely? And here's another thing that this is something that occurred to me. I don't know if there's any validity to it at all, but if you've ever seen pictures of a big predator, after they've taken down their prey, look at them. Their mouth is surrounded by red, and they've got usually a big red stain on their nose. And I think there's something predatory about a clown's appearance. I've often wanted to see how animals would respond to a clown mask, but they won't let me wear one at the zoo.
When it comes to these types of legends and folklore and everything that kind of always builds around it, like you were mentioning John Wayne Gacy and other serial killers, they always seem to have some sort of pattern that kind of goes around with them. When it comes to stories like the Bye-Bye Man, though, this is something that I personally have never heard of. This is something that I found very, very difficult to even believe. I mean, because I've heard of a lot of things on this show. I've heard of Frogman, Mothman, Wolfman, Dogman, Goatman. And now I have to Slenderman. Now I have to throw in Bye-Bye Man.
Yes. Well, to start with, let me point something out, that Bye-Bye Man is considerably older than the Slender Man. So he predates it. And his story is unusual in that it didn't come around. First of all, Slender Man is also very unusual. We know who invented Slender Man. We know the date that Slender Man first appeared online with those photographs that were created for the Creepypasta contest. So we know who owns the copyright on Slender Man because he is a copyrighted figure. Most folk figures aren't like that. You take somebody like Goatman, one of the several, Goatman of the Popelick Bridge, or one of the other Goatmen, because there are a couple of them. Goatmen of Prince George County in Maryland. We don't really know where they come from. They are old stories that associated with lonely places, often with lovers' lanes. You can come up with explanations for why they become associated with these places. But they appear spontaneously and over time. Sometimes they have some basis in truth, sometimes they don't, or if they do, we don't know what it is anymore. Now, the Bye-Bye Man's origin is a little different. I first heard of the Bye-Bye Man when I was attending a party given by a friend of mine who gives a party every year on what he calls Devil's Night, which is the night before Halloween. I've also heard it called Goosey Night, and where I grew up here in New Jersey, it was called Cabbage Night. And it's the night you're supposed to be mischievous. I've also heard it called Mischief Night. So it's the night you're supposed to go out and toilet paper a tree or spray shaving cream on the neighbor's windows, things like that. But he has a party every year. And every year at the end of the party, he asks guests to tell a ghost story or to tell a story that they personally experienced. So, you'd usually get 5 or 6 people who would tell about a ghost story, or they would tell about some strange thing that happened. Let's say they had a dream about a relative on the night that relative died, that sort of thing. And some of them were actually fairly creepy, but when they were done talking, my friend, whose name is Eli, he would tell the story of the Bye-Bye Man, and it was the way we closed the evening. Now, the story of the Bye-Bye Man happened to him and two friends of his, rather. So imagine three friends living in Wisconsin in the early 1990s. They're all of them college students. And the three characters are Eli, who told the story of the Bye-Bye Man, his girlfriend, whose name is Catherine, and a mutual friend of theirs whose name was Jonathan. Eli and Catherine were dating at the time. Jonathan was a friend of both of them. I have to lay that out so the rest of the story makes more sense. Well, Eli he worked in a group home where he kept watch over people who were suffering from a disease called Prader-Willi disease, which is a very odd disease. People who have it never feel satisfied, and they will eat almost anything. They'll eat a bag of flour. They'll eat toothpaste. They'll eat anything to try to satisfy this constant hunger. But he was he had to keep an eye on them to make sure they didn't run away and start eating. So he was working in this group home, and he was visited often by his girlfriend. And one time, that someone gave Eli an old Ouija board, and this Ouija board supposedly had been found in an attic where it was being used to keep a hole from appearing in the attic, or keep wind from coming through a hole in the attic, or something like that. So my friend Eli is very interested in psychic phenomena and very interested in scary phenomena. So he thought it would be fun to experiment with the board. So they began to hold, I guess you could call them seances. And Eli and Catherine would try getting results, no good. Eli and Jonathan would try getting results, no good. But it turned out that when Jonathan and Catherine worked together, they were able to get the board to move. They were able to get responses. So they started out, and they were getting responses, and they were nice, kind of like New Agey type spirits, talking about how nice good vibrations are, and it was fine. It didn't bother anybody. Oh, but that bored Eli. So he said, well, let's do some experiments to see if we're going to get a wider variety of spirits. So they called them spirits, but that isn't what he didn't think they were spirits. But they began to get this big variety of spirits that were really very much individuals. And the only way to reach them, and this is a kind of a unique thing about this story, the only way to reach these spirits was through a spirit called the spirit of the board. Now, the spirit of the board claimed to live inside that particular Ouija board. And when you got into contact with the spirit of the board, he would then connect you to another spirit. And they ended up being in contact with 10 or 12 different so-called spirits. And they could actually tell them apart because some of them moved the Ouija board slower, some of them used contractions, some of them didn't spell well, some of them did, that sort of thing. So it was all very interesting. However, Eli wanted to push it a little further, so he said, let's do some experiments. Let's see if we can get the board to give us responses under different circumstances. So they would try things like Jonathan would be blindfolded and Catherine would, but they would still be pushing it around, and they got answers. And then Catherine would be blindfolded, and then they would both be blindfolded, and then they would try it in the dark, and it all worked out pretty well. They were always getting answers to their questions, and they would continue getting these responses, and they were able to continue spelling them out even when they were blindfolded. So then Eli tried something a little more. He said, well, let's see what will happen if I don't tell you my question, but I write it down and concentrate on it and see if you guys can answer the question. And they did that for a while. They didn't have much luck with that one. And then they wanted to, then, all right, now this is the last experiment. This was the experiment that got them into trouble. Eli said, let's see if we can get into contact with a spirit or so-called spirit that can give us information that I can look up and validate that, yes, this thing really did exist, this person really did exist, and it is speaking through you two, and neither of you could have known this person. So, I don't know, let's give it as an example. Someone will give them an unusual name, claim to have been living in such a place at such a time, and they do a census search, and yes, they are able to uncover this person. That would be considered some validation that, yes, this is really happening. They didn't have much luck with that, but they did have luck with something else. And that was that the spirit of the board told them that there was a living being, a living person that wanted to get in contact with them. But this living person was evil, and the spirit of the board didn't want them to be in contact with this living person. Well, that was waving a red rag in front of Eli. That was all he wanted to see. He is fascinated by fear and the horror. In fact, he's written stories, he's even written plays that have been produced just on the subject of fear. So this really intrigued him. And he said, this is the one we want to talk to. We don't want to talk to anything else. Let's get in contact with this living evil being and see what happens. Well, Catherine didn't want to, but he kept at it, and finally they decided they were going to do it, but then all the other spirits that they spoke to disappeared because they didn't want anything to do with this evil being, and neither did the spirit of the board. He actually said that he wasn't going to have anything to do with this and stopped communicating, even though he really wanted to. He kept, I'm sorry, I'm getting a little confused. I've told this story many times, and I'm tripping over my own feet. He wanted to keep talking to them about the kinds of things they had been doing, but they wanted to talk to this evil being, and they said they were not going to talk to him anymore they weren't going to talk to the spirit anymore unless he put them into contact with them. And they sort of went on strike to get the spirit to do what they wanted. And after a lot of coaxing and many, many sessions, they finally forced the story of this living being from the spirit of the board. They never actually came into contact with the living being, but this all went through the spirit of the board. And I think we're coming up on the hour. Should we take a break?
Well, we got about 35, 40 seconds, and all of a sudden we're going to hear some music play in the background. But the comments that are coming through from the chat rooms here, they're all quite impressed with your storytelling abilities. You've captivated them. Captivated them, Mr. Schneck.
Thank you. Well, why don't I continue telling it after the break? Because after the break, I can tell the story of this evil being that they came into contact with and what happened to them after they made contact with this being.
Absolutely. I'm just amazed that you're one of the rare guests that we have had on this show that is actually watching the clock.
Oh,
there's the music.
All right.
Robert Schneck is our guest on Spaced Out Radio. We'll be right back right after this.
Looking for news beyond the mainstream news? Head to spacedoutradio.com and check out the SOR Spacewire. This is Spaced Out Radio's Eric Markham, News Director for the SOR Spacewire. Daily, I will bring you intriguing stories and outlandish reports from what's going on around the world. UFO sightings, paranormal activity, conspiracies, alternative health, and so much more. And if you have news, email me at news@spacedoutradio.com.
Hi there. I'm Butch Witkowski, lead investigator with U4Cop. On the final Monday of every month, you can listen to me and host Dave Scott on Spaced Out Radio's Strange Days. We're going to get to the heart of the matter when it comes to what's happening out there. People are seeing and experiencing things from ET contact to Bigfoot, and I want to hear about it. Your experiences are what we investigators need to help solve these unknown mysteries. So tune in at spacedoutradio.com.
Greetings and salutations, space travelers, from the Chronicles of the Unknown team.
What is Chronicles of the Unknown? I keep hearing about this thing.
It's a new paranormal reality TV show based right here in beautiful British Columbia, Canada. Follow our team as we uncover claims of activity on the Caribou Gold Rush Trail. You can also follow us here every third Monday, where two members of our team will be available to answer your questions.
Have you ever wondered about those weird and strange creatures people have reported throughout history? Do you wonder if those stories are real? Me too, and that's why I started Cryptopia.us. Hey, this is Rob Morphy, crypto historian. Join me once a month on Spaced Out Radio with Dave Scott, where we will get into the odd and bizarre reports, from the Dover Demon to hairy hominids and everything in between. I will break down what people like you and me are seeing at spacedoutradio.com.
Visit purpleplates.com today. For over 40 years, the Purple Energy Plates have been delivering amazing results for their many customers. Inspired by the great genius Nikola Tesla, the harmony, healing, and energetic effects of the plates have proven over and over to be beneficial and often miraculous to thousands of customers. With their money-back guarantee and the many benefits, how can you afford not to get one? Check their site for daily specials and choose from their many energy products. You won't be sorry. Visit them today at purpleplates.com for mind, body, and spirit, and expect a miracle.
Strange creatures lurking in the night, the sounds of wood knocking in the forest, odd happenings right out of a fictional world. These are the reports I love. Hi there, this is author Ronald Murphy, and I would love it if you join me and Spaced Out Radio host Dave Scott the second Wednesday of every month on our journey into the unknown land of cryptozoology at spacedoutradio.com. From Mothman to Frogman and everything in between. Hey, they don't call me the crypto guru for nothing.
Are you interested in advertising on Spaced Out Radio? Head to our website at spacedoutradio.com and click on our advertising tab. There, you will find an assortment of ways you can get your product out there with us, from radio commercials to banners and social media. Have a product you like our hosts to endorse? We can do that too. Visit spacedoutradio.com for more details.
From British Columbia to Northern California, Pacific North Weird has Cascadia covered. Check out our feature videos at spacedoutradio.com, where I, Vincent Zunza, and my super sleuth partner Alexandra Sullivan track down the weird and strange stories from around the Pacific Northwest, from Bigfoot to Mel's Hole and everything in between. This is what makes life exciting. So why report the normal when we can report the Pacific North Weird right here at spacedoutradio.com.
Oh, there's only one way to rock. Loud and proud. In high definition. Radio 702 rocks. Las Vegas.
Have you ever had an extraterrestrial experience? One you just couldn't explain? Well, maybe I can help. Hello, I am Samantha Mullet. On the second Tuesday of each month, I will join Dave Scott on Spaced Out Radio to bring a human aspect to ET contact. It's something I've lived with my entire life, and I'd love to help you understand. Let's share our experiences. The ET Experience, the second Tuesday of each month, only on Spaced Out Radio.
Hi there, this is Jolene with Reveal Reiki and Readings, and I want you to relax. Let me help you chill out and get in touch with your body, mind, and soul. In this busy world, sometimes we need to let go, and this is where I can help. Visit my website, rivuletrndr.wix.com/rivuletrndr.
Every Saturday and Sunday night, as Dave Scott wanders aimlessly in the wilderness, you can come hang out with me, James Tyson, in Spaced Out Weekend. Starting at 9 p.m. Pacific, midnight Eastern, I'll take you along as we talk with some of the best experts in their fields. SpacedOutRadio.com is the place to find us. So sit down, relax, put your feet up. Enjoy the topics like the paranormal, supernatural, intuitiveness, and so much more. Hope to see you there.
Hi there, this is your psychic medium Joanna, and I would love it if you would join us every other Sunday on Spaced Out Weekend. With host James Tyson, we'll bring you personal psychic messages on two mediums and a large. Questions about love, life, career changes. We would love it if you would come and join us live. Call in and listen in for the experience. Allow us to open the doors to your other side. Two mediums and a large, heard only on Spaced Out Weekend at spacedoutradio.com.
Would you like to become one of our space travelers? All you have to do is click on the Space Travelers icon at spacedoutradio.com. For only $5 a month, you can get access to some great prizes, as well as private monthly shows, newsletters, and a members-only section on our website. Become a space traveler today.
Do you have a topic or a guest that you'd like to hear on Spaced Out Radio? Let us know at spacedoutradio.com, where you can sign up to become a Space Traveler member today. Or you can find us on Twitter at Spaced Out Radio and on our Facebook page, Spaced Out Radio Show. Welcome back to Spaced Out Radio tonight. I am your host, Dave Scott. Good to have you with us. If you are a member of the SOR Space Travelers, Bill Cardwell has set the password. He does it every night. Make sure you use it wisely. Repugnance is the password for tonight. Repugnance. He actually put one on there I could pronounce. I'm always privileged when I don't butcher the password for the night. Remember, if you're listening in on Revolution Radio, the Double R Machine is a donation station financed by you, the valued listener. Do us a favor. If you can, donate today. If you want to follow us on Twitter, you can do so at Spaced Out Radio. Give our Facebook page a like, Spaced Out Radio Show. On Instagram, I can be followed at Dave Scott, SOR. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, Spaced Out Radio Show, and our website is spacedoutradio.com. While there, you could sign up for the SOR Space Travelers Club. It's only $5 a month, and with that, you get your name put into monthly prize draws that we do the final Friday of every month. You also get access to a private section for your postings on our website, and so much more. Check out the Bumblefoot banner. Our resident guitar god, Ron Bumblefoot THAL, formerly of Guns N' Roses, takes care of all of Spaced Out Radio's music. You can read the SOR Space Wire and so much more. Everything at spacedoutradio.com. Tonight we are talking with author Robert Schneck. We are talking the Bye-Bye Man and other strange and intriguing folklore stories that have come around, and there is truth in a lot of these. We bring Mr. Schneck back to Spaced Out Radio. Robert, welcome back.
Thank you.
Right before the break, you were telling us an intriguing story of how the Bye-Bye Man came into play. I would love it if you can continue on.
Okay, so where I left you off was 3 college students who were experimenting with the Ouija board were trying to get in contact with a living being who was very evil, and that the Ouija board didn't want them to talk to, but the spirit of the board finally relented. And over a couple of weeks, probably, certainly over a number of Ouija board seances, they finally got the story of this being that the spirit of the board would not put them into direct contact with. But they finally got the story of this person. And the story went like this, that this being, who was called the Bye-Bye Man, was born sometime in the 1920s in Louisiana. He was born an albino. We never know whether he was racially black or white, but he was an albino, so he had very light skin, and he was blind. And his parents gave him up. Whoever his parents were, we never know, but they gave him up and sent him to some kind of an orphanage. Now, he was not happy at this orphanage. He was blind. He was an albino. Children were probably cruel to him. That's just a guess based on how children act. And he was always running away, but how far can a blind albino kid get? So they would always catch him and bring him back, and he was unhappy there. And as he got older, finally he reached adolescence. And according to the story that they were told, One day he picked up a pair of scissors, and he attacked and mutilated one of the nurses. She lived, but she was terribly damaged. But he attacked her and escaped from the orphanage for good and vanished. They don't know what happened to him, but they do know that mutilated bodies began to turn up by the sides of railroad tracks. And it seems that something happened with this boy that became the Bye-Bye Man. Maybe it involved voodoo, because it was Louisiana. It was near New Orleans. It was actually in a town called Algiers, which turned out to be one of the districts of New Orleans. I don't think the three college students who were writing the story down knew that Algiers was a part of New Orleans, but it is. They apparently thought it was a small town, but anyway, that's where the orphanage was. But once again, these mutilated bodies, began turning up by the railroad tracks, and it seems that this boy had become involved in black magic. And what he was doing was he had used whatever power it was that he had acquired to build a little monster. And he was probably taking the eyes and the tongues from people that he encountered and sewing them together into this monster that somehow was brought to life. And it acted as his eyes. It helped him find other people. And what he would do is this. Well, I'll give you a quick picture of what he looked like. According to the story, they were told he was, of course, an albino, so he had white skin, and he was one of those albinos who have pink eyes. So he had white skin, pink eyes. He would always wear dark glasses that were painted black on the inside. He had long white hair. He wore a broad-brimmed hat and a shirt something like a peacoat. He would have been dressed a bit like a hobo, and he carried a sack that had bloodstains on the bottom, and this sack was called the sack or bag of gore. And when someone heard the name the Bye-Bye Man, or the name of his monster, the monster he made from pieces and remains of his victims, which was called Gloomsinger, it would turn that person into a psychic beacon, so that for as long as they thought of the name Bye-Bye Man or Gloomsinger, but as long as they thought of the name Bye-Bye Man, it would send out a kind of a signal to him, and he would begin to move towards the person thinking of his name. So he would begin to ride the rails. He always traveled by train, like a hobo. He would ride the rails, and when he got close enough to the person who kept thinking of his name, then Gloomsinger did its job. And what Gloomsinger would do is, I guess it would pull itself along on those tongues and use all of those eyes, and it would see the victim. And then it would let out a sharp whistle. And that whistle would help the Bye-Bye Man close in on the victim. So it acted a little bit like a pointer dog. It would point out the victim, and then the Bye-Bye Man would go in for the kill and take the tongue and the eyes and put them into his bag of gore. Presumably, he used the pieces inside the bag of gore to freshen up Gloomsinger when the pieces that were sewed to him would begin to decompose. Well, they then asked the three who were doing the experiment with the Ouija board. They asked if the Ouija board, if the Bye-Bye Man was aware of them, and the answer was yes, he is, and he's moving towards you. Now, they were living in a place called Sun Prairie, which is outside Madison, and outside Madison, Wisconsin. And according to the spirit of the board, the Bye-Bye Man had already reached Chicago and was moving towards them. Well, this did it for Catherine. She had no interest in pursuing this any longer. It terrified her. She wanted nothing to do with it, and since Jonathan and Eli could not get the Ouija board to work on their own, that more or less put an end to the seances. But it didn't put an end to the fact that they were thinking about the Bye-Bye Man and Gloomsinger. Well, it turned out that over the next, I don't know how long it went on. I guess it must have been a while because it was getting closer to summer. And they had started the seances in the dead of winter. So they're getting close to summer now. And Catherine's sleep is very disturbed. She keeps waking up, having nightmares, having panic attacks, feeling uncomfortable and depressed. And Eli, meanwhile, is having no trouble at all, and he doesn't quite know what's bothering her. So one of the things he decides to do is to take her to his hometown, which is Wausau, Wisconsin, on the Wisconsin River. It's not a small town. It's called a small city on the Wisconsin River. And it's a nice enough little town. I've been there. And he was going to take her to a concert, cheer her up, have a good time. So they spent the afternoon walking around Wausau, and he was going to show her the sights. And one of the sights in Wausau is a place called Barker Stewart Island, which is an island in the middle of the Wisconsin River. The nickname of Barker Stewart Island is Body Island. And it was called Body Island because lumberjacks that died upstream would sometimes they would drown in the Wisconsin River, and their bodies would sometimes turn up on Barker Stewart Island. So again, they're hanging around this. It's a pretty island. It is a nice island, and there's a railroad bridge leading from the edge of the shore to the island itself. Now they were hanging around there because it's a pretty area. It's a little nature reserve. And Eli went down to the river itself. He said he thought he saw a turtle down there, so he went down to look at it. And that left Catherine alone up on the railroad bridge. So here she is on this bridge leading to Body Island, and she's, I guess, just looking, maybe she's looking at what Eli is doing or something, and she begins to hear a whistle. Now, hearing a whistle when you're on a railroad bridge is not too surprising. I mean, these are railroad tracks, so a whistle is not, you expect to hear a train whistle now and again, but she said this wasn't a train whistle. And the whistle got louder and louder, and she began to panic because she remembered the story, and that did it for her. She became utterly terrified. She went running off the bridge. Eli didn't know what was going on, but he went running after her. She spent the rest of the day terrified, having panic attacks, and she was probably so completely through with all of this that they stopped dating soon after. Now, this was not the only thing that happened. Eli then went to go visit his friend Jonathan, who was still in school. So he went to go see him, and apparently Jonathan had been having problems very similar to Catherine's. He was having trouble sleeping. He was having nightmares. He was having trouble getting through the night. And he apparently also looked very tired. And he explained to Eli one of the reasons that he looked so tired. He had been having trouble sleeping. And he was sitting in bed just drawing or something to pass the time when he heard a knock on the door. Now, he was living in a rooming house on the living in the third floor in an attic bedroom, and there was a light outside in the hallway, and he could see that there were the shadows of feet through that crack of light under the door. And he heard Catherine's voice saying, "Hey, Jonathan, it's morning. Come on, let's go get breakfast." So he gets up sort of groggy, and he's starting to throw on some clothes. when he looks out the window and he sees, no, it's pitch black outside. And he checks the clock. And it's around 3 or 4 in the morning. So it's not morning. It's the dead of night, just like it was the dead of winter earlier. But it's the dead of night. And Catherine's voice continues in the hallway, and the knocking on the door continues, with her saying, "Come on, Jonathan, let's go get breakfast. Let's go. We're here. We're here to pick you up." And that made him so terrified that he slid to the ground and lay there on the floor looking at those 2 shadows of feet and the crack of light under the door until they moved away from the hall and the knocking stopped. And he spent the rest of the night there on the floor, absolutely terrified. Now, that roughly is the story of the Bye-Bye Man. But the story itself goes on a little further. Now, Catherine, again, wanted nothing more to do with this. She didn't. Well, I'll get to what happened later on. But again, she wanted nothing more to do with this. But Eli loved the story. It was fascinated. It fascinated him. So he kind of made a few changes, and it became his Devil's Night story. He must have told this story to hundreds of people before I heard it. And I attended one of these parties, and again, I heard it for the first time. Now, I have heard a lot of stories. Doing what I do, people tend to tell me the stories about ghosts and monsters, and I have heard stories about, I remember I was at the barber's once, and the barber was from Egypt, and he told me, after he asked me what I did, and I told him I collect these kinds of stories, and he told me about seeing seeing an evil spirit in the form of a hoofed demon standing on the grave of deserters who had been shot when he was serving in the Egyptian army. I've had people tell me stories about vampires, Bigfoot, ghosts, lots of ghost stories. One person who claimed that a light bulb in the attic would answer questions. It would flick off and on, giving yes and no replies to questions. But I have never heard a story that got under my skin the way the story of the Bye-Bye Man did. In fact, the morning after it, I was lying in bed looking at that crack of light under my door and wondering if I was going to be seeing 2 shadows under it. So what I finally did was I began to write it up. And when it came time, when I wrote my first book, I decided to include it. I came very close to not including it because most of what I write about is strange historical stories. But this story was just so intriguing, and it had its Ouija board history behind it, so I felt that I could include it. And I looked into the background of it, and I did research, due diligence and all that to see if there was any truth to the story. Nothing I could find. But the story itself was so effective and had such an effect, made such an impression, that I began telling it, when the book came out, I began telling it on the radio like I just did tonight, and it was somebody hearing the broadcast of it in California that liked it so much that that's how the whole movie thing got started, and from there the book has since been re-released recently. It's now It's re-released as The Bye-Bye Man, and it's available as an audio book with Scott Brick narrating it. And so there's a new edition of it coming out, and there's a movie coming out on December 9th. So that is the story of The Bye-Bye Man. And I recently got somebody who wants my help in finding him. I got an email from somebody who wants my help in finding him, but I don't want to go looking for him. And as I said, that's more or less the story of the Bye-Bye Man.
Do you believe that this creature, or whatever it is, actually exists, or do you believe that this is just spirit on the other side of the Ouija board playing havoc with someone? Because, let's face it, the Ouija board does have that power to do that.
Well, let's look at some possibilities. If you believe that it is a spirit involved, then yes, maybe it was a Maybe it was a mischievous spirit that thought it would have some fun and scare these people. Maybe it was something actually malevolent that got a thrill out of doing that. If you want to start speculating, maybe it was an evil spirit that decided that if people became aware of its name, it could acquire some kind of reality in this world. And then you get into something like the Phylth experiment, which I don't know if listeners are familiar with it, but the Phylth experiment was carried out by the Toronto Society for Psychical Research in 1972, and it involved a group of researchers who put together a story of a nobleman, a Renaissance English nobleman named Phylth, who they invented the story. They did it on purpose because they wanted to see if they could hold seances and come into contact with a spirit that they invented, the spirit of somebody who never existed, because they had a theory that it was the people who take part in seances that create the phenomena themselves. And it seemed to work out. Phylth would answer questions. Phylth would move the table. On one or two occasions, Phylth would even levitate the table. It was one of the most important experiments ever in psychical research. And it's been replicated. There have been other people that have done the same experiment where they would create a character and get seance room phenomena through what they believed was group PK, that is, group psychokinesis. Now, if group psychokinesis is a real thing, then maybe it was the people who were participating in the Ouija board seances that believed or came to believe in the reality of the Bye-Bye Man that caused these phenomena to happen, and maybe did give it a kind of a life in the real world. But as for the origin of the story, you can argue about that. I suspect that the origin of the story came from a mixture of the participants' own experiences. Eli, for example, as I mentioned before, is fascinated by horror. He has written horror stories and horror plays. He is fascinated by psychical research and certainly knew the story of Phylth and how he was created through Group PK. And then there was Catherine, who had a number of experiences. She had a number of what she believed were paranormal experiences in her life, and certainly accepted the possibility of it. And Jonathan, who was also very interested in horror and in frightening subjects. So it could be that each of them contributed in their own little way to the story that eventually came out through the planchette. And also you have to understand something, that this was not a laboratory experiment. It's not like they had some sort of rule that there will be no discussing the story of the Bye-Bye Man unless we are actively engaged with the Ouija board. No, they talked about it among themselves. Presumably they speculated. Presumably they wondered, well, maybe this happened. Maybe this is what happened. So I suspect that a lot of what was involved was a sort of a group creation of the story. And I've seen this happen in other areas. For example, I once attended a meeting of the Intruders Foundation. Now, the Intruders Foundation was the group that Bud Hopkins ran in New York City for people that believed they had been abducted by aliens. Now, in this group, there were about 200 people there. And they were mainly there to hear a lecture from a woman who believed that she and her partner had been abducted and had undergone many abductions. And as I was watching this group, David Jacobs, who's also very well known in alien abduction circles, he stood up and he mentioned that one of the things he's been researching is the kinds of toys that the half-breed alien human children are playing with in the large motherships that are supposed to be circling the Earth, that are in orbit around the Earth, because some abductees claim to have been taken to these motherships. They claim that their DNA or their semen or their eggs were used to create these alien hybrids. Now, when David Jacobs asked this question, to my mind, what he was doing was he was actually contributing to the story, because you can be sure that once that question was asked, a lot of the people involved began to remember, in the loosest sense of the term, remember seeing these sorts of things. And so it's an ongoing creation of a story. If you like, it's how a myth or folklore is created. And I think something like that was involved with the Bye-Bye Man's creation. However, if you believe that the Philip experiment did happen, was accurately reported, then you do have to consider the possibility that real phenomena resulted from this thing that was created in the imagination.
And that's the key, is you really believe what you think is on your mind. Because a lot of people can use a Ouija board for entertainment purposes or even communication purposes and never have anything bad with them. We have, for instance, Karen Dahlman, who is very familiar with the Ouija board. She'll be actually doing a live Ouija board session on this show during Halloween night. And she's never had anything wrong happen with her, or anything evil or demonic or scary like the Bye-Bye Man try and come through. But do you think, then, that it's the energy that one puts into it that really alters the reality?
Well, I don't really have much of a theory about it. I try not to lock in too much on a particular theory, but if you do accept the possibility of thought forms, if you like, you can call them tulpas or egregores or many other, there are other names for them. If you accept that possibility, and certainly there are a lot of mystically minded people, as well as people who have been involved in parapsychology, who have accepted that possibility, then yes, it might explain how phenomena like what was reported with the Bye-Bye Man occurred. Now, the Bye-Bye Man is going to be changing, of course, soon, because there was the story that came through the board. Now, the original story, as written down by Eli in notebooks, was lost years ago. So the story that we get is his version of it after having been told at these parties for years. Now, I asked him to try to get back to what he believes was the most stripped down, unembellished version of the story, because as he would tell it, he would add things, he would dramatize it, because he's a good storyteller. He's a very good storyteller, and he wants you to enjoy the story he's telling. He wants to frighten you. So we tried to strip it down to the most basic and closest to what really happened. And so it went from a story that was told by a Ouija board to a story that was told at parties to a story that I told in my book and a story that I do tell on the radio. And now it's going to be a story that's going to be that's going to be made into a movie, and millions of more people are, again, the numbers stagger me. Millions of people are going to hear about the Bye-Bye Man, whether they see the movie or not. They'll hear the commercial. And what is it going to evolve into? I never, ever in a million years expected something like a movie. That never even occurred to me. My ambition for the Bye-Bye Man, if I can be said to have had one, was that he become a part of American folklore. What happened with Slender Man is what I thought might happen with the Bye-Bye Man and Gloomsinger. But strangely enough, what actually did happen was I told the story, and suddenly I was signing contracts so that these people were optioning it. So they didn't own it, but they had a lot of say in what could be done with it. So the stories about the Bye-Bye Man that were beginning to appear online were being taken offline by lawyers, because I was seeing that the story was already changing as it was being retold online. but it never did become it never became what the Slender Man became. But it has, it is going to undergo some interesting change in Hollywood. And I have no idea what they did to the story. I had no contact with them at all. They bought the rights, and that was it. That's the last I heard of it. I don't even know how they made him look beyond the poster.
Well, let's just hope they don't do to you what they did during the Conjuring series with the Perron family. I remember Andrea Perron telling us on this show that when they did the original Conjuring on her story, that they really didn't take the facts, and Hollywood just went Hollywood on it because it's loosely based on a true story, and that's how they get around with everything. So I hope that doesn't happen for you.
Well, you've got to remember something. I'm in a slightly different position than someone like her because those were her personal experiences. I am one in a chain of storytellers that involve the Bye-Bye Man. So even though it is one of my favorite stories and it's one of the stories I'm proudest of, at the same time, I don't have the personal connection to it that someone like her would have had. So if they make changes, I don't take it personally. I understand that it's a visual medium and they are going to have to do it a little differently. I don't even know if they included Gloomsinger. I have no idea what they did, to be honest. All I've seen is what they did on the trailer, so at least I know they did keep the trains, and I'm glad about that.
Well, at least it says something that they actually are leaving part of it to stay together. That's for sure. I mean, you know what? I never really got into the whole aspect of how Hollywood kind of massages things for their own benefit, because the story is better than the true story in their minds. There always has to be the conflict. There always has to be something that is different that they make it their own, but it's sad when you see stories such as, like I just mentioned, The Conjuring, or the real story of Travis Walton and Fire in the Sky, where, Hollywood made the ETs seem very, very evil and raunchy and grotesque to what they did with them, and he's like, no, that really didn't happen at all. Like, it would be nice if they just took the story and made it, because some of these stories are just so freaky, Robert, in their own, that they don't need the filler or some writer in some room saying, I'm just going to elaborate on this part over here, or I'm going to elaborate on the Bye-Bye Man actually being, a true character where he has a face and a persona and everything. You know what I'm saying?
I do, but, I don't hold it against them because it is a different medium, and I can discuss things in a book. I can discuss background, and I can discuss all sorts of things in a book that just do not translate to the screen. I mean, Dave, you must spend a lot of time talking to people who have had paranormal experiences, right?
Absolutely. I've had my own. And that's the reason why we started this show.
So you know that they rarely, almost never, have a satisfying conclusion. What usually happens is the person has an experience or a number of experiences, and then for no good reason, they just peter out. Right? Yeah.
And the way I explain that to our listeners, and they're probably sick of me hearing this, is when you have a paranormal or a ufological or a cryptid experience or whatever it may be, it's like unlocking a door. And when you open that door and walk through, you think you got the answer on the other side, only to realize there's 10 more doors that you have to open on the other side. And then when you've unlocked each of those doors and walked inside, there's 10 more doors behind each of those original 10 doors, and it just keeps going and going, where there really isn't an answer. And I can understand where you're saying that, Hollywood does have to create a conclusion.
Right.
But in certain stories, they've had that conclusion, and yet they've taken it and absolutely shattered what the original story was. Like if you take something like the Travis Walton story in Fire in the Sky, the story was intriguing enough. I mean, it was written for them. until they had to go Hollywood on it. That's my only point. You know,
Right.
a story like The Bye-Bye Man, where really there's no ending to it, I could see them making something up, you know, loosely based on a true story. I could see that happening. You know what I'm saying? But I think there is a difference.
Yeah, well, and also, I would also add that there's the difference of someone like Travis Walton or the lady involved in The Conjuring, where these were their personal experiences, and they're going to take it a lot more seriously than essentially someone like me who is just telling the story. I wasn't involved, you know? My big contribution was I heard this story and I realized that this is something very good. This is something that I have to... Remember I told you at the beginning that when I was little and I found a good story, I would run to show it to my parents? When I found this story, I wanted everyone to hear it because it was just such a good story. It was so... It scared me. It was interesting. It had a lot going. It felt like folklore. Even though it had never been folklore in the ordinary sense, it felt like folklore. It felt like the kind of story you're told around a campfire, even though it never had been. And it came from a Ouija board. So I wonder how many Hollywood stories began with a Ouija board. That's another question. But again, I really don't hold it against them. And there is another aspect to it. You know, Hollywood writers they'll write a romantic comedy, then they'll write a thriller, then they'll write a Western. They do that sort of thing. They are not invested in whether the paranormal... They have no investment in the paranormal, really. It's just another story to tell. So I can understand why they would be less worried about filling things in, bending them, adding a romance that wasn't there. I think they should keep it within limits. I mean, there have been examples where true stories were so distorted that they became an embarrassment. But for something like this, I can certainly understand why they will make changes. Oh, you know, I meant to mention something that I forgot before. I had to get releases from Catherine and Jonathan for the contract to go forward. And eventually I had to track them down. This is where being a researcher really comes in useful, because I was finally able to track them down. And Catherine had one request, and that is she wanted nothing more to do with it. She was happy to do it. She was happy to sign the release. She wanted no money, nothing like that. She wanted nothing more to do with this whole thing. So I have to assume that this was a traumatic experience for her. Jonathan was much more relaxed about it. He just happily signed it and went back to what he was doing. But I think it says something about how deeply it affected her. I think if she were, let's say the movie's a hit, and let's say that people go looking for the real Catherine and the real Jonathan, I could see where someone like her would be upset if they did make changes, because again, this was her real experience. I don't have a dog in the fight, you know? I guess that's really the bottom line for it.
On the flip side, is it kind of exciting that Hollywood has come to you with your writings and say, hey, we think we may have something in a film here? You know, I think that would be very intriguing to receive that email or that phone call.
Oh, it was. It really was. First of all, it was something I never, ever, ever expected to happen. You know, you have to remember, I lead a writer's life. I can go for a week without talking to anyone. I won't say I'm a misanthrope, but I do spend a lot of time alone because I'm writing. And the idea of that whole Hollywood world is just so strange to me. You know, everyone's good looking, everyone's young, everyone seems to be rich, and I'm a shabby little writer in my apartment just grinding out stories about strange things that have happened. The excitement for me is I simply cannot even imagine that I'm going to be flying out there and there's going to be an opening and a red carpet and the whole bit. That is just, I don't even have a pair of shoes. I got to buy a pair of shoes. I simply don't know what's going to be happening. It's so strange to me. And I'm very excited, too, because for nothing else, I'll sell more books and people will hear about my other books, which I'm happy about because I think I've got some stuff that a lot of readers will enjoy.
That movie's supposed to come out this December, right?
Well, it's supposed to come out on December 9th. This is the third date they've given, though, so I'm going to just assume it's December 9th and go with that.
Well, I hope for you that they are kind to you in regards to your writing and the Bridge of Body Island, or the Bridge to Body Island, which you wrote, you know, because the movie is based on that book, you know. And like I said, it can be very, very cruel dealing with Hollywood, and hopefully you don't have to get any of that, you know, and I hope you made sure that they were taking care of you as well.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I haven't had any bad experiences with them at all. Everyone's been very nice. The guy who wrote the screenplay, I'm Facebook friends with him. In fact, maybe some of your listeners might have even heard of him. His name is Jonathan Penner. I think he won on one of those Survivor-type shows, or he might have, and he was an actor, and so he's done some things. And the guy who actually plays the Bye-Bye Man is an actor called Doug Jones. And Doug Jones is well known as playing the Gray Man in Pan's Labyrinth and playing, he's playing that sort of fish man in Hellboy and a bunch of other things. And he is he's the nicest man. He's really... he plays a lot of horror roles, but he apparently is a real sweetheart. So I'm looking forward to meeting him. Also, Faye Dunaway is in the movie, and I'm really excited about that. The fact I might get to meet Faye Dunaway, but that's something else.
Sounds like a childhood crush there.
It is. I guess a bit. Yeah, I suppose so. But you know, as far as I'm concerned, is if the check clears. Everyone's been great. I am fine. You know, I have no complaints at all. And the possibility that there might be sequels, who knows? For me, that'll just sell more books. So I'm good.
How did they come to you and say in that email or that phone call, say, hey, we want to do a movie on your book? How does that happen? Because I've always wondered that.
Well, I can tell you. Again, I did the show. I did the radio show, and it was either rebroadcast or something out in California. And a director named David Pryor heard it. Now, David Pryor has since died. He died in a car accident before the movie was even made. But David Pryor was, I tell you, he made some really bad horror movies. I mean, just terrible horror movies. But he made some great documentaries. He made two documentaries about the Zodiac Killer that are really well done. I recommend them to anyone. Just look up David Pryor and Zodiac Killer, and these documentaries are terrific. So he contacted I think he might have contacted me directly, because I always give out an email or contact information, and I didn't believe him. I just didn't pay any attention to it. I forwarded it to my editor, and the editor did all the arranging. And after I got all the releases and signed everything, they sent me a contract which truly had to be seen to be believed. The contract was over 50 pages long, and I had to go over every word of it. So after doing that, and it seemed fine to me, we signed, and I forgot about it, because I don't know much about the movie business, but I do know enough to know that the chances of a film actually getting made are slim to almost nothing. From what I understand, they start trying to make hundreds of movies a year in Hollywood and end up making a fraction of them. And even if a movie gets made, it might not get released, or if it gets released, it gets a limited release. So, you know, there are so many things that can go wrong. But after a couple of years and me just pretending that I wasn't thinking about it, a friend of mine called and said, your name is in Variety magazine. And I said, why? And they said, because they're making The Bridge to Body Island into a movie. And since after that, it started to go very fast. Once that happened, and the screenwriter contacted me and asked me a couple of questions, and that was the last that I had to do with him. So from there on, then there was a call for people to audition. In fact, I think there are even still some auditions for The Bye-Bye Man on YouTube, which I was surprised to see. And then they announced that they were scouting locations, and then they ended up picking. They filmed it in Cleveland, which I think was a very good choice because it's Midwestern, like Wisconsin, and they have a lot of trains there. So I think it was a good choice. So that they filmed it in Cleveland, and again, it just went so fast because it went from there to okay, it's done. We're just going to edit it, and then we're going to get started on putting together the promotional. So now there's a trailer for it on YouTube. And again, it got pushed back because of other things that happened. For example, I think the studio released a movie that didn't do well, and they were kind of hoping that this movie would follow up on that release. But again, I don't know how these things work, but they are going to be releasing it in December, and it got good preview reviews. So, again, I haven't seen it. I have no idea what to expect, just what I saw in the trailer.
That sounds really, really fun and interesting to see how it all comes together for you, especially since you're seeing the beginning parts. Do they keep in contact with you, Robert, in regards to this?
Nothing, not at all.
That's got to be frustrating.
No, well, it really isn't so bad because I just became Facebook friends with some of the people involved. So when I had a question or something, I'd write to them, and they would answer. Everyone has been really nice to me. I've heard horror stories, but it hasn't happened to me. Like I said, everyone's been great, and I will say that I have had to make an effort on my part. Otherwise, if I hadn't made an effort, I wouldn't have known anything that was going on. I had to do Google searches once a week to see if any new developments had occurred, because no one ever told me anything. They never told my publisher anything. So it was, we had a few little problems, but apart from that, it's been fine. And, I'm going to go out there, spend my 2 or 3 days, be surrounded by people who I never thought in a million years I would ever even meet. Maybe I'll go to Grauman's Chinese Theater. I know I want to visit something called the Museum of Death out there, which is supposed to be pretty interesting. Maybe I'll go on a Black Dahlia tour or something, and then I'll come home and get back to writing.
During your time when you were talking with Jonathan about the Bye-Bye Man, did he ever give a description of what the Bye-Bye Man so-called looked like?
No, he never saw him. Remember, he only saw the shadows under the door.
Right, I understand that, but did the Bye-Bye Man via the Ouija board give any sort of explanation?
A description, you said?
Yes.
Well, it was a description. It was, if I remember correctly. Now, don't quote me on this because I might be a little. My memory of it might be a little. I haven't read the story for a while, as you can imagine. But if my memory of it might be a little distorted by the images that are coming out from the movie, but if I remember correctly, tall, thin, white-skinned, of course, wearing the dark glasses painted black on the inside, long white hair, a broad-brimmed hat, a navy-type peacoat, sort of vaguely nautical-looking jacket, pants and shoes, and also looking kind of run down. Again, a vague hobo quality to his appearance, and of course carrying the sack of gore. But beyond that, that was, I think, as much detail as we got. But as something like what his facial features looked like, nothing that specific.
I mean, when I think of this creature, I hate to use a wrestling term on this, but I think of, the WWE's Undertaker, with the round Stetson, with the long black trench coat, and having some eerie music almost following him. You know what I'm saying? That's the image I get when I think of this. What do you get if you were to use your imagination thinking of the Bye-Bye Man?
Well, I actually get something a little more of a scarecrow type build. That's always how I saw him. A cadaverous scarecrow type. Very, very long and thin and stretched out. Long fingers. I never was able to, sort of a vaguely skeletal, thin, undernourished face. But keep in mind with the dark glasses and everything, I imagine him looking almost like a living skull type face. I think they're doing something close to that. I don't think they're using the dark glasses in the film. Judging by that, there's about a 1 second view of the makeup artist's concept. I don't know if the makeup artist designs it. I guess not. I guess the makeup artist executes it. But whoever designed the Bye-Bye Man seems to have designed him with a pale face, with skin that looks vaguely cracked, maybe slightly decayed or something, and no dark glasses, at least that I saw. Again, you can see for yourself in the trailer. It's on YouTube, and you're given just the quickest glance of him. They're keeping him under wraps. There's one photograph, one still from the film that's been put online where he's sitting in a library. I don't know what the story is. I guess the filmmakers kept them as college students. That might explain it.
Well, either way, it's interesting how everybody's imagination will run wild on something like this, because when it hits the big screen, he's definitely going to have a persona. That's for sure. Yeah. That's something we can agree on.
Oh, yeah. And again, Doug Jones is popular in his own right. So this is going to become one of his characters. So on that, he's going to enjoy a certain degree of popularity. And it's going to be so strange for me, because this is the sort of thing where maybe I'll go to a horror convention and there'll be people dressed up like that. They'll cosplay, that sort of thing. I can't imagine that, to have a story that was told by a Ouija board become a part of our culture. That is, I'm not saying that's going to happen. It would be very exciting for me if it does. But at the minimum, the Bye-Bye Man is going to be up there. He'll be joining the same group as other cinematic monsters like the Gray Man, and I guess even Freddy Krueger and Jason and people like that. As a sort of a supernatural boogeyman.
We have a couple minutes left with you before we go to break. Is there anything that you specifically asked for that should be put in the movie that is just part of this legend and lore, or did they consult you on anything like that, or is it all up to them?
It's all up to them. They did everything the way they wanted to do it. And again, like I said, if this was something that had happened to me, I would be more concerned about it. But this was a story that I heard and I retold, and now they're going to hear it and retell it. They're not going to worry so much about whether it is conveying the original message or telling the same story, because that's not in their interest to do it. Their interest is to create as entertaining and as scary a story as possible. And for my own self-interest, I also want them to do that, because even if it's not totally accurate, the more successful their movie is, the more people will be interested in reading the story. Because I would love to get horror fans reading my books, because I think they'll enjoy them.
And on that note, we hear the music playing. We're going to hop out for a break here at the top of the hour. You're listening to Spaced Out Radio. I'm your host, Dave Scott. Robert Schneck is our guest. We'll be right back.
Greetings and salutations, space travelers, from the Chronicles of the Unknown team.
What are these Chronicles of the Unknown? I keep hearing about this thing.
It's a new paranormal reality TV show based right here in beautiful British Columbia, Canada. Follow our team as we uncover claims of activity on the Caribou Gold Rush Trail. You can also follow us here every third Monday, where two members of our team will be available to answer your questions. We'll give you some equipment updates and some of our experiences on the road, right here on Spaced Out Radio.
Hi there, I'm Butch Witkowski, lead investigator with U4 Cop. On the final Monday of every month, you can listen to me and host Dave Scott on Spaced Out Radio's Strange Days. We're going to get to the heart of the matter when it comes to what's happening out there. People are seeing and experiencing things from ET contact to Bigfoot, and I want to hear about it. Your experiences are what we investigators need to help solve these unknown mysteries. So tune in at spacedoutradio.com to the final Monday of every month from Butch Witkowski's Strange Days.
Visit purpleplates.com today. For over 40 years, the Purple Energy Plates have been delivering amazing results for their many customers. Inspired by the great genius Nikola Tesla, the harmony, healing, and energetic effects of the plates have proven over and over to be beneficial and often miraculous to thousands of customers. With their money-back guarantee and the many benefits, how can you afford not to get one? Check their site for daily specials and choose from their many energy products. You won't be sorry. Visit them today at purpleplates.com for mind, body, and spirit, and expect a miracle.
This is your medium, Joanna, from Spaced Out Weekend, 2 mediums and a large. I would love it if you would come and join us with host James Tyson every other Sunday on Spaced Out Weekend. Together, we will take your calls and your questions live. Our goal is to provide you with a positive outlook on deep questions that you may have. Questions regarding love, relationships, money, or whatever else is on your mind. Come and check us out at spacedoutradio.com.
Have you checked out the SOR Spacewire at spacedoutradio.com yet? Every day we post the latest stories regarding the weird, strange, and completely unbelievable. From cryptid and UFO sightings to the conspiracy world, we tackle it all. Hi there, I'm Eric Markham, Spaced Out Radio's news director for the SOR Spacewire. And if you have a story, I want to hear it. Email me at news@spacedoutradio.com.
Patrolling the Pacific Northwest, we are always on the lookout for the strange and unassuming stories that real people are experiencing. Hi, I'm Vincent Zunza from Pacific North Weird. Me and Alexandra Sullivan have teamed to bring to you those odd stories that never seem to make it into the mainstream. Stories so weird that will leave you scratching your head wondering, is this real? It's as real as it gets with Pacific North Weird. You can watch our videos right here at spacedoutradio.com.
Become more intimate and interactive with Spaced Out Radio. Join our Space Travelers Club with your new membership. For $5 a month, we'll provide you with special access to the website, monthly prize draws from books to psychic readings, along with monthly newsletter, private interviews, and more. Sign up today to be part of Spaced Out Radio's experience.
Every month on Spaced Out Radio, we look into the deep and dark reports of cryptids roaming around the world with me, Rob Morphy, from Cryptopia.us. I would love it if you would join me and host Dave Scott as we delve into the most arcane stories and reports regarding creatures of the unknown. My job is to hunt down the details and bring the evidence forward to you. These aren't your regular Bigfoot stories I'm talking about either. You can find out more about crypto history at spacedoutradio.com.
Looking for a place to advertise at a very reasonable cost? Look no further than Spaced Out Radio. SpacedOutRadio.com has an advertising tab that you can click to check out our daily, weekly, and monthly packages to play on the radio, or our website including social media. From commercial spots to banners, we have it all. Check out our competitive pricing today.
You hear footsteps in the empty room above you. A rocking chair begins rocking by itself. Don't be afraid of the things that go bump in the night. Reach for Spirit Storybox, the iPhone app the Huffington Post UK called the only ghost hunting app you will ever need. Spirit Storybox. The spirits are telling their stories. Are you listening?
Strange creatures lurking in the night, the sounds of wood knocking in the forest, odd happenings right out of a fictional world. These are the reports I love. Hi there, this is author Ronald Murphy, and I would love it if you join me and Spaced Out Radio host Dave Scott the second Wednesday of every month on our journey into the unknown land of cryptozoology at spacedoutradio.com. From Mothman to Frogman and everything in between. Hey, they don't call me the crypto guru for nothing.
Find yourself constantly looking up in the sky, looking for answers? Have you had extraterrestrial contact? Are you an abductee? Looking for answers to your experiences? Hi there, I'm R. Keith Andrews, Spaced Out Radio's resident ET expert. Join me live the first Friday of every month where I take questions from the Spaced Out Radio chat room and help you understand those from the far-off world. It's 2 hours of knowledge every experiencer should listen to. Hope to see you there.
Did you know that Spaced Out Radio runs 7 days a week? Hi, it's James Tyson from Spaced Out Weekend. Every Saturday and Sunday night, starting at 9 p.m. Pacific, midnight Eastern, you can join me and my guests for some great chatter about what's going on out in the universe, or even in that dark part of the basement you really don't want to go back into. Well, let's find the answers to your experiences together. So come on up to Uncle Jimbo's cabin on the weekend. For more information, look us up at spacedoutradio.com.
Would you like to connect with us on Spaced Out Radio? Head to spacedoutradio.com to check out the latest shows, guests, and sponsors. And don't forget to sign up for the Space Travelers Club. You'll find all you need at spacedoutradio.com. Welcome back to Spaced Out Radio tonight, final hour, as we kick off the new week, the first full one in September. Tomorrow night on the show, John Carlson will talk with us. The Paranormalist will be discussing missing time and a subject I absolutely hate. But we're going there. We're going to talk about gnomes tomorrow night on Spaced Out Radio, 9 p.m. Pacific, midnight Eastern Time. If you are a Spaced Out Radio SOR space traveler, Bill Cardwell has set the password repugnance tonight. Repugnance is your password, so if you're a space traveler, make sure you use it wisely. If you're listening on Revolution Radio, remember the Double R Machine is a donation station funded by you, the valued listener. Do us a favor and donate today. If you want to follow us on Twitter, you can do so at Spaced Out Radio. Give our Facebook page a like, Spaced Out Radio Show. On Instagram, I can be followed at Dave Scott, SOR. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, Spaced Out Radio Show. And our website is spacedoutradio.com. While there, you could sign up for the SOR Space Travelers Club. All you got to do is sign up for the membership, step 1, which is around $5 a month. With that, you get your name put into monthly prize draws, you get access to private group interviews, access to a special section on our website, and so much more. And while you're on the website as well, you can read the SOR Space Wire, check out our latest blogs. Mine is on Bigfoot. And, of course, all of our music is provided by legendary guitar god Ron Bumblefoot THAL, formerly of Guns N' Roses. Tonight we are talking with author Robert Schneck. We are discussing, in the last hour, we discussed The Bye-Bye Man. We're going to get into a little bit of Bigfoot and his other book, The President Vampire. I think that one's kind of interesting. Robert, welcome back.
Okay, I'm ready to go.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. And now all my audience is going to start hammering me about gnomes because they know I cannot stand those things. Just can't stand them, Robert.
Well, there are gnomes and there are gnomes. Are we talking about the ones with the little red hats that stand out in your garden?
Yes, those horrid little pieces of art. Oh. You know, I'll tell you the reason why. And I've mentioned this a couple of times on the show. I'm someone who has had a plethora of experiences that, well, led me to start this show. A lot of people will say, nobody can have that many different experiences. You got to be making something up. But I'm putting my credibility on the line here every night I do this show. And that's the reason why I am doing it is because I'm like most of our listeners who are trying to find answers to the weird and strange things that has happened to them. The only difference is with my radio background, I have the ability to start up this show and do it in a broadcast form. But a number of years ago, after my first wife and I split up, I had a basement suite, and my landlords had gnomes in their garden. My daughter, who has been very intuitive ever since she was tiny, like 18, 19 months old, when she was saying that she was seeing things over top of her TV. And it was absolutely incredible because she, I do have to say this, my little girl, she's not so little anymore. She starts grade 12 tomorrow morning. So I'm a little emotional over that. But anyways, when she was about 7, 8, 9 years old and I lived in this basement suite, a few times she actually came running into my bed, and she would crawl into my bed, and normally she doesn't do that. And I would be like, what's the matter? She goes, Daddy, you know those gnomes in the garden? I said, yeah. She goes, I heard banging on my window, and it woke me up. And when I went and looked through the blinds, I didn't see anything, but I saw the shadow of what it looked like a little gnome running back towards the garden.
Oh, God.
Right? And, normally, I would say this is childhood imagination. Okay, but looking at my daughter is someone where, we've always believed her when she said she saw things, okay? We always believed that we lived in a haunted house, and there was a little girl in the home. And there would be times, Robert, where, every time before bed, we would have nightly cleanup of the bedroom before we went to bed. So we'd tidy up her room. And from there, what would happen is I'd wake up at like 7:15 the next morning. And sometimes she would be awake. The odd time she wouldn't be. And I'd wake up in the morning for work, and I'd go into her room, and her room is a complete disaster. And she would swear up and down that, Daddy, I didn't make the mess. I didn't make the mess, and in the most profound child way, like she was upset about it. And then one day, my daughter was at her grandma's house for night, and my ex-wife and I are sitting there watching a movie downstairs, and we have the two dogs, or the dog with us and the two cats with us, and all of a sudden we hear my daughter's door creak open. And we hear the pitter-patter of little feet running down the hall. And my wife and I had a squeaky bed. It was what we could afford at the time, and it was comfortable, but damn, it was loud and squeaky. And you know how kids use mattresses as a trampoline?
Oh, yes.
All of a sudden, we start hearing on our trampoline, And the funny part about that was, we lived in a duplex. Our best friends lived in the other side. They didn't have any paranormal activity whatsoever. And it got to the point, Robert, where one day I'm at work in Vancouver, which is an hour and a bit away from where I lived. And my neighbor's wife, or my buddy's wife, calls me up and says, "Are you in the missus' home?" And I'm like, "No." She goes, "Can you stop doing your thing? It's really loud." And I said, "I'm in downtown Vancouver, and the missus is at work, so it ain't us." She goes, "Well, somebody's doing something on your bed because it sounds like there is an absolute good time going on in there."
Right.
And I'm keeping that as politically correct as possible as I say that. But it wasn't until, getting back to the original story, it wasn't until we heard the pitter-patter of little feet come out of her room that we really said, well, hold on a second here. Maybe she's on to something. And we never really, went the way other parents did. Well, oh, that's your imagination. That's just your mind making up stories. We knew different. So when she saw those gnomes, I tell you, it was absolutely frightening to me, just frightening to absolutely hear her say that, the little gnomes running by. So I've hated gnomes ever since then. They absolutely scared the living crap out of me.
I'm curious, Dave, when she was away, was the room messed up at all?
In the morning it would be. Or when she was away?
She was away.
The room, you know what? I don't even remember if we had tidied it up beforehand or not. And that's the mystery to me.
Oh, okay. All right. Just curious. Because I'll tell you, that's where I thought the story was going. That she was away and the next morning her room was still messed up.
No, unfortunately. Unfortunately, no. So I just find it extremely funny that you sit there and you listen to what these silly gnomes are up to, and oh man, I get a little worked up about it, Robert. I hate gnomes.
It's funny. I've noticed some people also get very worked up over ventriloquist dummies. A lot of people find them very disturbing, the way people find clowns disturbing.
I can see that. I can totally see where ventriloquist dummies would get that. And you know what? The popularity of things, whether it's Robert the Doll or Harold the Haunted Doll or Annabelle, or up here in a museum north of me in a place called Quesnel, they have a haunted doll called Mandy. These haunted dolls seem to be popping up absolutely everywhere, and it's almost like the new nightmare of everything. I mean, back in my day when I was young, it was only Chucky. We only had to worry about Chucky.
Well, there is also the doll. I'm sorry. I'm blanking out on their names. The people that did the investigation.
Ed and Lorraine Warren?
The Warrens, yeah. I think a lot of it comes from the Warrens doll, the one that they keep in the ones that she keeps in her museum. That seems to be the origin of a lot of those. And of course, having things like Chucky doesn't help.
No, not at all. But at least you knew that Chucky was coming at you with a knife, so you just didn't buy a Chucky doll. It was nice and simple. But now, everything seems to be one of these cases where we can get some sort of haunting.
Yeah. Well, folklore does change, and what people consider the paranormal does change over time. Take something again like clowns. That simply never existed before the 1980s. There is nothing like that. Nothing even comparable to that I know of in American folklore, at least. There was something. There were cases of phantoms harassing people. In my first book, The President's Vampire, I tell the story of the Gloucester Militia, which was a group of, they seemed to be phantom soldiers made up, they looked like French invaders and local Indians who were harassing the people that lived in Gloucester, Massachusetts, in 1692, just while the Salem witch trials were getting underway. And what happened with them was they would see these people and they would be chased by them, or they would chase them. They would chase them through the woods. They would fire at them. Supposedly, they would even hit them sometimes. They would fall down, then get up and run away again. And one of the odd things about these phantom militia, these phantom invaders, was that they looked perfectly normal, but they would run over swampy spots without leaving footprints. It became so bad that they eventually called in a real militia from Ipswich, and the real militia saw them out in the woods too and chased them and were never able to catch them. Cotton Mather tells the story in his book, in his history of the church in America. So he tells the complete story of these phantom invaders that bothered the people of Gloucester in 1692. Interestingly enough, the main person, Ebenezer Babson, who was the first man to see one of these invaders and the one who ran into them most often, he had a connection with the Salem witch trials in that his mother claimed to be bewitched, and he sort of rented the girls who were, well, rented's not the right word, he borrowed them from the people of Salem Village and Salem, and he had them come down to Gloucester to see if they could see the witches that were tormenting his mother. And of course they claimed they could, and there was almost another witch trial in Gloucester because of this, but I don't think it ever really developed into anything important. So that's the closest thing I can think of, at least in American folklore, to something like the clowns. And I know there have been other similar phantom invaders, Spring Heel Jack type invaders. I have a chapter on that in the book too. That one of them that appeared in Baltimore, Maryland, in the 1950s. There were similar things to that. So there were always phantoms, but phantom clowns, that was unusual, especially ones driving vans.
Now you've also had an intriguing interest over the years in Bigfoot.
I have always loved Bigfoot. I think, like I said, if I lived in your part of the country, that would be what I would concentrate on. When I was little, the whole idea of a giant hairy animal, a giant hairy monster, or a giant hairy primate living, still existing in North America, that was actually being seen by people, and they were running into him. That I was so intrigued by that. I read every book that came out at the time. Now, keep in mind, I'm 52, so this would have been there was a whole, I don't know if this was the same in Canada, but in the United States, there was a real upsurge of interest in cryptozoology. It was a minor golden age of it, where you had people like Rene DeHinden and John Green and Ivan Sanderson, and all these people were seriously going after it. This was no nonsense. These were not hoaxers. These were not people that were trying to make a cute TV show or get ratings. These were serious researchers, some so serious that they were actually disagreeable, like Rene DeHinden. But You know, the idea that these men were taking it so seriously just fascinated me. And again, if I had lived in your part of the world, there is no doubt in my mind that I would have been out there looking as a child, looking for Bigfoot. It would have just been too much for me. Of course, living where I am in northern New Jersey, we have our own monsters, but nothing that seemed as real as Bigfoot, because there was just simply no reason why a Bigfoot couldn't live there. There were questions about whether the local forest could produce the right kind of food for something like that, and I understand all those questions, although to my mind, any place where a bear can live, why couldn't a Bigfoot? But that's for another day, and I just don't know the subject well enough to argue it. But again, that's always been one of my fascinations, which is why when you told me that you had 2 sightings, I have to ask you to tell me the story.
Well, my 2 sightings happened at the exact same time. And in September of 2013, so we're like, I think it was around the 10th. So we're almost at the 3-year anniversary of that. A friend of mine owned 10 acres in the backwoods of the town I lived in. And the property at that time had been in his family about 41 years. And he took me back into the forest behind his property. And he's like, I want to show you something. Because back then there's trails in there, but it's not like a hiking trail or mountain biking or motorcycling or ATVing. It's not that type. Like, this is a very private area that kind of eventually connects with the mountain ranges here in the Pacific Coast. And
excuse me, Dave, was it an animal trail?
Yeah, you could pretty much call it that.
Oh, okay.
But a worn out one. Okay.
Uh-huh.
And the story goes, and I'll give you the long version here. The story goes, we were walking back there because back when he was about 10, 11 years old, him and his friend were playing cowboys and Indians in the forest and all this, and they kind of caught each other, and they're like, hey, what do we want to do? And I've actually talked to the friend as well, and he's like, God is my witness, this happened. And they were kind of standing there, kind of looking at each other, like, do we walk back to the farm now, or do we just continue on hanging out? Because I guess maybe it was getting to lunchtime or dinner time. I don't know the circumstance. And they were standing about 2-3 feet apart by a tree when all of a sudden they heard whoop, and smack. In the tree was an old school rock-headed arrow. Like
wow.
one that a Native American or a First Nations soldier would use, not soldier, but Indian would use way back in the day. And when this thing passed between them, they looked at each other, looked at the arrow, and they went running. And they were probably 600-700 yards from the entry point to the farm. And my friend, I remember him telling me, he goes, I've never ran that fast in my life. So they actually went back and the arrow was gone. But they remember seeing the actual feather, that it was a rock arrow. It wasn't like a fiberglass or whatever they are using today, he's a couple years older than me. So if you go back 40 years, maybe, I don't even know what kind of wood, maybe bamboo or something along those lines. I'm not too sure what kind, because I'm not really up in the archery. But
a factory made.
Absolutely. It was nothing factory made. That right. They could tell.
It was not a mass-produced arrow.
No. So we ended up, anyways, he wanted to show me where this incident happened. And as we're walking along the trail, we're probably 300, 350 yards from the entry to the farm. So we're getting pretty deep into the forest. And we come across this tree that is snapped at about 8 feet high. And this is a big tree. Like, it's probably round about probably 18 inches around. So pretty solid tree. Mm-hmm. And the bark is still wet. Like, this is fresh. We hadn't had any thunderstorms or windstorms or anything that would push us down. There was no rotting on the tree, nothing. And I remember saying to him, because I was just getting into all of this, because my happily boring life had come to an end just a year and a half, 2 years previous to this, with my own experiences. And we were standing around, and I said, Bigfoot has been known to knock down trees. And so we just kind of looking around, doing our very unscientific, type of research on this, and just thinking how weird it was. And we all of a sudden got the feeling that we were being watched. And so we started looking around, because there are bears in the area, there are cougars in the area, and neither of us had pepper spray, and nobody carries a gun up here into the forest, at least this close to town. And so we started looking around, and at about 100 feet right in front of us, which would have been due north, in the shadows of this tree, we see this face sticking out from behind this tree. And I kind of look, and I said, do you see that? And my friend says, what are you looking at? So I pointed to him, and you could make out the face, and then all of a sudden the face pulled in behind the trunk, and then you could just see the shoulder, and then the face would come out again, and you could see the eyes, or where the eyes would be, in the mouth and the nose. And I said, I think that's a Bigfoot. And we watched it for about 5 minutes, and it would tuck its head out or in behind the trunk of the tree, and then it would come out and it would look, and then at one point we'd only see the right shoulder sticking out. And we're like, this is kind of cool. So after about 5 minutes, we just kind of went, as silly as it sounded, you don't even think, and I laugh at these people who say, well, I would have grabbed a picture, I would have done this, I would have done that. You just don't do that. You're not even thinking about it. And at 100 feet on an iPhone, you're not going to see anything anyways. You're just going to see a tree. So we were watching this, and we decided to turn around, and, being that we're kind of spiritual people, literally, we waved at it, and we said, we're going to thank you for showing us. We're going to leave you alone now, and we're just going to continue on. So I start to turn, and I'm turning to my right to go back down the path, when at about 85 feet, so if this first Bigfoot is at midnight, the second one's about 1:30 on the clock, but at about 85 feet, so it's closer. Mm-hmm. And what caught my attention to that was I saw this branch shaking vigorously, almost like you're trying to knock some nuts off a tree branch, or cherries or apples or whatever. You just shake that branch vigorously. Mm-hmm. And I stopped and I looked, and that's where I saw the second one walk right through where that branch was shaking. Wow. And this thing, I got a full right profile of it from the waist on up. So I didn't see the hands, but I did see the arm. I saw the waist. I saw the back. I saw the head. You know, it never looked at me. But this thing was barrel-chested. Like, I'm going to say it looked to me to be at least 350, 400 pounds. Like, large. And there was no neck. It went straight from shoulders to head. And it was kind of a pointy head with the face kind of slanting down. And then it walked right through those trees and it was gone. And the brown color, it was almost like a reddish brown, but more brown than red.
Like a cinnamon bear?
Yeah, absolutely. And it was beautiful. It was absolutely beautiful.
You know, I think you're the first person I've ever heard say that it was beautiful.
I don't know how else to describe it.
You mean
majestic?
Like
yeah, it was just one of those situations where when it happens in front of you, you want to take it all in.
Uh-huh.
I didn't feel any fear, neither did my friend. We never felt any fear when we saw this. He never saw the second one. I saw the second one. He saw the first one with me. We never felt any fear, but we did feel that it was time to go.
Uh-huh.
And there's a fine line to be drawn in between those, Robert.
Yeah. I'm curious, Dave. Did it feel normal? I mean, like, if you had been in the woods and you'd seen an elk or something, would it have felt any more bizarre than seeing an elk or a bear?
No, it would have felt normal.
Okay, like it felt as normal as that.
No, this felt different because you have to realize, Robert, you're seeing something that's not supposed to exist.
Right.
To the mainstream.
It's looking at you.
The first one, yes. The second one, no. Right? But when you're looking at something that isn't supposed to exist, it sends your mind for a loop.
Yeah.
And what's funny is, in that same forest, less than a year later, so that was September, so October, November, December, January, February, March, April, May. So we're looking at 7 months later, in that same forest, is when I came face to face with an extraterrestrial.
This area sounds unusual.
Oh, it's. I wish my friend never had to sell the property, because there is never mind a book, there is a movie, a documentary, a scientific experiment to be there. The amount of UFOs, the extraterrestrial contact, the Bigfoot contact, across the street in the forest, there was something vicious in there that was spiritually just really unkind. Like it was like the portal of all portals on this property.
It was like it was a local Skinwalker Ranch kind of thing.
Kind of, but without the evil on it.
Right.
The ranch was, the farm that we call it, it was protected.
Uh-huh.
But the weird things that just happened there and in behind, it was absolutely amazing. And I don't know if I'll ever have that experience again, but if I get a chance to see Bigfoot again, I definitely know what I will do.
Which is what?
I'll just stand there and watch.
Yeah, I can understand that.
And I will try and get as close to it as possible, because there's a couple things I learned from this. I have a lot of First Nations friends up here.
Uh-huh.
And the first thing I would probably do if I'm going on a Bigfoot search is I would bring tobacco with me along with some sort of offering. Berries, like strawberries, blueberries, raspberries, something along those lines. First Nations, a peace offering to anything that is spiritual is tobacco. So I would definitely bring tobacco with me. And I would go from there. But here's the interesting part to my story. And I forgot to mention this to you. About 4 or 5 days later, we would do nightly perimeter walks a couple times a week around there just to see what we could pick up. And this is where my opinion of Bigfoot actually changed to where, normal people who go out there and research, they think we're looking for Gigantopithecus or some sort of ape-like creature. I don't believe that. I think it's similar, but I don't believe that, because in my experience, up here, the First Nations people, they tend to believe with Bigfoot that it is a shapeshifter and or an interdimensional being. And to me, that seemed really sci-fi. But 4 days or 5 days after this sighting, we were doing a perimeter walk around their house, trying to see what kind of spirits were playing around that night. And there were 4 of us. And we came across, from the back of the house, we were walking to the front of the house. And we got about halfway along the house, and I said to the group, I said, it feels like we're being followed. I feel like we're being followed. And the lady in the group says, yeah, I'm kind of getting that feeling too. The other 2 were not. So we turned and looked behind us, and behind the house they had this old cherry tree that probably stood 20, 30 feet high. And at the bottom left of this cherry tree, from the ground to about 8, 10 feet high, there was this pixelation that was hanging around there. You know, like much like on television when they pixelate someone's face so you can't recognize them.
Sure.
That's what it looks like. I saw it. The lady with us saw it. The other 2 did not. And the other 2, being frustrated, they said, well, let's continue our walk. We're not seeing anything. And we're like, pixelation, right there, pixelation.
Right.
We walked another 20 seconds to get into the front of the house. And as we walked to the front of the house, that's when we heard the roar from behind us. To me, the pixelation, along with the roar, is way too coincidental to say that there's a Gigantopithecus, and this is a, as I've said on this show many a time, Robert, pardon me, there is a big difference between what it could be, in my opinion, and what I like to call Caucasian Christian Science, which is, if it's not part of the 5 senses and what we know on this earth, it doesn't exist.
Well, it's interesting. I don't know if you're familiar with Jonathan Downes and his Center for Fortean Zoology in the United Kingdom, but John has always been very much takes the straight scientific view on cryptids. They are flesh and blood animals. We are going to I shouldn't say that. I shouldn't talk for somebody else. John's always been a little open to the fact that some of these things might be different, that they are things like Owlman and stuff like that, because he has looked into those stories. But he always takes as scientific an approach as possible when he's doing an investigation. Well, if you remember a few years back, there were a number of Bigfoot sightings in Great Britain. And the idea that there could be a large primate living wild in Great Britain is it just seemed so utterly absurd. But it was kind of fascinating because here were people giving accounts that were just as reasonable as anything that somebody might have happen in a place like Northern California or Oregon or British Columbia. So John went out with a bunch of the people that he worked with, and they were at this lake where sightings were occurring. And John saw something that he simply could not describe. It was, the way he described it was like the outline of a Bigfoot done almost as a cartoon and absolutely flat. But he watched it move he watched it move, he watched it walk. And the experience bothered him so much because it was so unnatural that it actually, he actually ended up talking to Lauren Coleman about it, because he called him from England because it had upset him so much. And Lauren tends to take a very straightforward mammal primatology approach to these things, but even he acknowledges that some of this stuff is very strange. And it overlaps. One of the things I actually wanted to ask you about this place was whether there had been any terrible crimes there over the years, just out of curiosity.
We had a shaman come in who's a friend of a bunch of us who hung out together. And when she came in, and she was very intuitive as well, when she came in and kind of felt the property, she could feel a ton of First Nation spirit, like dozens of First Nation spirits. And she actually picked up, she was walking through the backfield, and she was like, okay, here's the teepee, here is where they had a fire going, and this is where they would go look for deer because it was up on a mountain, so there wasn't any fishing close by. And so she had everything kind of coming to her as we kind of spoke with it. So there was a lot of First Nations area. And in that area, back in the 1800s and 1700s, going previous to that, there was, if you went another, I'm going to say 10 miles west, that's where there was a lot of battle area of First Nations when the bands from Vancouver Island would come into the mainland, and they would fight, to the death in these great Indian battles, that would happen. And so there's a lot of First Nations type energy around the entire town and the entire area. So the whole bow and arrow thing right at the beginning when I told that story, that makes
was
total sense to me.
That was quite a start to the story. I mean, but one of the things that's so interesting is the idea of, John Keel talked about window areas where strange things happen, and of course, the main one he was interested in was Point Pleasant, West Virginia. But judging, if you take the Keelian point of view, this area sounds very similar. I ask about whether there were any terrible crimes or something or anything like that in the area, because one of the aspects of Bigfoot that I find interesting is this occasional, and it's only occasional, but this occasional contact, or let's say association, between Bigfoot and truly horrific crimes, of which there are two that always stick in my mind. And one of them I actually found. It was the very first thing I ever had published on the Strange and Paranormal, or Strange But True. And that involved a series of sightings that were reported by the mass murderer Charles Starkweather when he was awaiting execution. He was given a notebook and asked to fill it, just to write his life story. And one of the things he wrote about was that when he was young, growing up in Lincoln, Nebraska, he would see this figure outside his window. And he said it was female, but the drawing of it that he made, it was just an outline, but it was this massive, it looked like a silhouette of a Bigfoot. And he said it would let out these horrific screams. And for him, this figure it represented death. And now you can look at that two ways. Here is somebody who grew up to be a mass murderer. Maybe that's the way he interprets something that somebody with a less depraved outlook might not see that way. But he did. There was this association, and no one had ever interpreted Starkweather's account the way I did there. And I've always been interested in that. And of course, later on, after I wrote that, it turned out that a serial killer at Yosemite called Cary Stayner claimed that he had more than one encounter with a Bigfoot. So I have always had there's this little thread of association between Bigfoot and these awful crimes. I mean, really some depraved stuff that I guess it's kind of an antidote to the Bigfoot is a wonderful nature spirit kind of a thing. There is another aspect of it that I think is worth considering.
It is an interesting story indeed, because I know with the Patterson-Gimlin film being, to me, the only real true film of Bigfoot out there, even though it's 50 years old, it's amazing how that video is still scrutinized half a century later as much as it is. It's scrutinized more than the Zapruder film for JFK's assassination.
Yeah, I don't think they've ever done a stabilization of the Zapruder film. Just now that you mention it, and I'll be honest with you, I have been going back and forth about the Patterson-Gimlin film my entire life. When I was little, the very first time I saw it, I'm sure was on the TV show In Search Of, narrated by Leonard Nimoy. I am sure that is the first time I saw the Patterson-Gimlin film, and I thought that looks real. And then as time went on, I would doubt it because the whole thing just seemed so improbable. I mean, why would this be the only decent film that ever came out? And then, of course, the stabilization came along, and you had people who were studying it, and people that knew a lot more than I did who said it really does seem to be the large dimensions that were described, and the limbs don't bend the way a human limb can possibly bend. And then the stabilization came along, and those look like toes. I mean, those look like real living feet. At the same time, then somebody else will look at it and say, no, that's so obviously a fake that it's I don't know. I still don't know what to make of it, although my heart says that thing's real. And that's really all I can say about it, is that I believe it because it just seems so real to me. It looks like an animal. The hair moves like an animal to me. It's like if somebody asked a bear to run across a field on its hind legs, it would look no less real than that. Again, I don't write much about Bigfoot. I've written the little thing I mentioned about Charles Starkweather, and I've also written probably the largest piece I did on Bigfoot was I tried to put a new perspective on Ape Canyon, which is the famous siege of the miners by Mount St. Helens in 1924, I think it was. And for me, the main guy, at least as far as the history of Bigfoot is concerned, the main guy involved was named Fred Beck, who was the miner and prospector, and mainly he worked in the lumber industry like so many people do in that part of the country. And he wrote a book about it called I Fought the Ape Men of Mount St. Helens. Now, I Fought the Ape Men of Mount St. Helens has always been the Bigfoot people have always had mixed feelings about it, because the first 3 pages or so is a fairly straightforward account of what they say happened. That is that the men were up there digging a mine, what they thought was going to be a gold mine, and they saw a hairy Bigfoot-type creature, fired at it, and were attacked that night in their cabin, where stones were thrown, and apparently the things were walking around on the roof, and whatever those things were, they knocked one of the they weren't tree trunks, they were squared off, but I guess a squared off tree trunk. He knocked the filler between them, and so they could see these creatures supposedly running around outside, and they fired at them during the night, and it was a frightening experience. They left the next day, leaving hundreds of dollars worth of mining equipment and abandoning their claim. And the story became part of the local folklore. It eventually, the area, which had been called Long Canyon, was renamed Ape Canyon, and it became part of local folklore. Then in the 1950s, when Bigfoot research really got started, Fred Beck became one of the people that you interviewed when you were studying Bigfoot. So people like Peter Byrne and John Green, they all interviewed him. But when he wrote that booklet, I Fought the Ape Men, you learned an awful lot about Fred Beck. And what you learned was, first of all, he was a spiritualist, and Fred Beck actually had 2 Bigfoot sightings. He had a much earlier one when he was working at a lumber camp with his brother, and he saw something from the tent that his brother always claimed was a bear, and that Fred Beck said, no, that was not a bear. And then, of course, he later had the sightings at Ape Canyon. But what most people don't realize about Fred Beck and the other miners is that they were looking for gold not in the standard way. They were using seances and summoning spirits in order to find gold. And what they did was they came in contact with this spirit who shot an arrow into the air, and they followed this spirit arrow over hills, and then it came down on the ground, and that's where they were told to dig, and that was the gold mine they were working on. And when they began to hear whistling in the hills at night, and they felt they were just on the verge of finding gold when they had the frightening experience with the attack by the Bigfoot, and they fled. Now, again, it becomes an odder story, especially when you really read the pamphlet and you realize that Fred Beck was so interested in spiritualism, and he did not believe that Bigfoot were normal animals. He felt that they were interdimensional creatures that they came from a lower spiritual plane than human beings did, that they were attracted by the mining, they thought it was interesting, or they were just... He actually felt that since humans were superior to Bigfoot, that they were attracted to humans too, because we have a natural attraction to whatever is superior to us, was from his perspective the way it worked. So that was one of the reasons why they materialized in our plane, on the material plane of existence. Keep in mind, this is not unusual. This is a pretty straightforward spiritualist critique of how something like Bigfoot might work. And of course, Fred Beck went further, saying that he did not think that anyone would ever catch a Bigfoot, because if you killed them or trapped one, it would somehow go back into its own dimension. So we might find footprints, we might find droppings, because as long as they were materialized, they had to eat and live and drink like normal animals. But then when they dematerialized, however or whyever that would happen, they would return to their own plane. But one of the things I found so interesting about the story of Ape Canyon was the way it resembled traditional treasure hunting stories. Now, it's not widely known, but there is a long tradition of magical treasure hunting in the United States, where people who might be very respectable would go out at night with a book of spells and a sword and some shovels, and they would look for buried treasure, because buried treasure was believed to be all over the country in the early years of this country. And usually there would be a local legend about pirate gold, or Tories fleeing the revolution had hidden gold, or American Indians had put together. There would be a pile of things like I don't know whatever they would value, maybe precious gems or something like that, would be piled up, and even gnomes. Speaking of gnomes, in fact, there was a belief that gnomes would pile up treasure underground, and they would use one of the ways to find gold, let's say a dowsing rod or something similar to that, and they would find a spot to dig. They would then cast a spell, draw a circle around them to protect them from the spirits that were supposed to watch over buried treasure, usually malevolent spirits. That's the old story about how pirates would kill one of the men in a treasure party so that his ghost would haunt the treasure and it would drive away anyone else who tried to steal it from them. That's probably the best known version of that, but it was widely believed that buried treasure, gold mines, things like that were all protected by demons, monsters, and ghosts. So what they would do is they would cast their spell, and it would keep the monsters away as long as they didn't speak. If someone spoke, it broke the spell. They were no longer protected, and they ran away. Well, one of the things I found so interesting about that was the similarities between Fred Beck's story, where they conjured spirits. The spirits led them to treasure. If you go into more detail in what Beck wrote, he talks about how a good feeling had prevailed, but one of the men spoke when they were following that arrow that was leading them to the gold mine. He spoke and he cursed the spirit for leading them on a wild goose chase. And Fred Beck felt that they had lost the spiritual protection that they had enjoyed up until that point, because they had been prospecting via seances for a long time out in the woods, but they had never felt vulnerable before. So here they were just on the verge. He felt they were just on the verge of coming to the gold, and just as they reached the gold, that's when these monsters attacked them. That's when these protective spirits attacked them and drove them away from their gold. So they had to abandon everything and were left with nothing, just the way the traditional treasure hunters were. Strangely enough, that same year is also the same year that Albert Ostman was out looking for a gold mine when he claimed he got carried off by a family of Bigfoot and had to escape.
And that incident happened about, I'm going to say 250 miles from where I am right now.
Oh, it was the something outlet, Toba Inlet. Was that right?
Yes, Toba Inlet.
Yeah, that's right. So in 1924, one group and one individual that went out looking for gold had their expeditions canceled by Bigfoot. And if you look, there is this little bit of relation. There are some connections between Bigfoot and gold mines throughout Bigfoot lore. Now that's not unusual considering how much gold mining went on in the Pacific Northwest. But there are other examples of it in other parts of the country where there is a connection made between Bigfoots and gold mines. It's not as obvious as you get in the story of Ape Canyon, when there is literally summoning spirits and not casting spells in the traditional sense, but in the idea of men having these good thoughts, good spiritual vibrations, and finally they ruined it themselves, the way traditional treasure hunters would speak and break the spell, and suddenly they became vulnerable to the protecting demon or monster, which drove them from the site. Anyway, it's just something that I found very interesting, and I think I think your listeners might find those connections surprising.
I think the whole story is absolutely incredible. When you look at the Patterson Gimlin film, what gives it up for you where you can say, Robert, I believe this is real?
There's one scene where it's just walking away, and it's not the scene where it turns. It's the scene where it's just walking away, and it looks so natural. It doesn't look like anything that was put together. I read Greg Long's book on where he tried to debunk the film, and I was not convinced. I thought actually that Greg Long seemed like a truly unpleasant person, and that had nothing to do with with debunking the film. It just struck me that it made reading the book kind of an unpleasant experience. But I never got the feeling, looking at some of those stills, that looked fake. And I know this is not proof. I know this doesn't mean anything. But I have watched every Bigfoot film that has ever come out, and none of them looked as real as that.
What made it real for me, and I'm convinced on this, and I will argue this point with anybody, if it is a suit, there is no way whoever created a suit is going to put a pair of breasts on that Sasquatch. And that is a female Sasquatch, and nobody is going to take the time, if they're going to grab a gorilla suit from make one or grab one from a costume store, they're not going to put a pair of boobs on it.
Well, the only reason I can think of why, let's say it was a hoax, let's just say, for the sake of argument, it's a hoax, was that they were trying to get it to look like that female Sasquatch that was seen by Roe on Mica Mountain. That was, I think, 1937 was that? Or
right.
Something like that, where it couldn't have been that early. It must have been 57 or something like that, where he gave that very detailed description of this creature that was just sitting there eating leaves, and the drawing of it that was later made. The breasts are very pronounced, but I just don't see it. Well, let me ask you something, Dave. When it was walking away, when you saw it walk away, did it feel like the figure in the Patterson-Gimlin film?
I wish I would have seen the legs. I wish I would have seen the legs. I mean, seeing only the upper torso was incredible. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say that I saw something, try and, the hair was flowing or whatever like that, because it wasn't. I didn't see that.
Right.
My friend, we are almost out of time.
We'll
have to continue this. We got to bring you back on, because we got another book we need to talk about, The President's Vampire and other weird stories. So we have to do that, my friend.
We will. Can I mention one thing?
Absolutely.
People that want to reach me can reach me at my Facebook page, which is called Historian of the Strange. I post something odd or offbeat there, usually from old newspapers, every day. And anyone who I write down when I'm appearing on radio shows and giving lectures and things like that. So if you want to reach me or send me a note, you can give Historian of the Strange a like. And if you like my books, I'd appreciate a good Amazon review.
And our audience will definitely give that. You know what? It's absolutely a pleasure, Robert, to get you on this show again. We definitely have to do it again. You hold on, my friend. I got to wrap this thing up, because it is that time. And unfortunately, my daytime career kicks back in tomorrow after the long weekend. So I got to do that as well. So you hold on. Space Out Radio tomorrow night, we will have John Carlson on. We're going to talk about everything from missing time to them damn garden gnomes that are going to come alive. I don't know where they're coming alive, but we're going to discuss it tomorrow night. It is absolutely great that all of you joined us in the Revolution Radio chat room, in the Spaced Out Radio chat room on Spreaker, and of course, our flagship chat room, the SOR Space Travelers on Facebook. Hey, KJ, you can go to bed down in Florida now. It's late for you, so make sure you've done that. Yes, this show flew by. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter at Spaced Out Radio. Give our Facebook page a like, Spaced Out Radio Show. On Instagram, I can be followed at Dave Scott, SOR. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, Spaced Out Radio Show, and our website, of course, is spacedoutradio.com. Thank you to Robert Schneck for being with us tonight. We're going to bring him back on. This was way too good to only do this one time. Way too good. Love a storyteller like that. Kept me absolutely intrigued the entire show. Thank you to everyone. We'll do this again in exactly 21 hours from now. You have a good time. I'm having a good time. And apparently I'm losing my voice all of a sudden. Wow. Good timing for that, since the show is almost over. Appreciate you taking the time with us. We'll do it all again. SpacedOutRadio.com. Do me a favor. Tell a friend. We appreciate it. You have a good one. Good night.